Chapter 378. In the half-elven palace. Colin walked through the dark corridor and came to a secret basement. The air was filled with the faint smell of blood and the lingering smell of death. What? Failed again? Hearing the voice behind them, the three half-elven female doctors in the basement came back to their senses and quickly greeted Colin. Colin waved his hand casually, indicating that they did not need to be so polite. Then, he walked to an operation table in the middle of the basement and found that the two monkeys on the table, one big and one small, had become corpses. One of the female doctors said with a sad face, "I'm sorry, my lord. We have tried many times, but we still can't successfully complete the cesarean section operation you mentioned. Because you can't control the blood loss." Colin looked at the blood flowing everywhere and asked. "Yes, my lord. Then you should be able to use this method to take the fetus out of the mother's body, right?" The female doctor hesitated for a moment and nodded, "Yes, but, my lord, if you use this method, the fetus may have a chance to survive, but the mother will definitely die." The three female doctors had of course guessed why Colin wanted them to test this cesarean section operation. When they thought that they might have to use this method to cut open Her Majesty's belly, they could not help but tremble. If anything happened to Her Majesty or the fetus in her belly, they would definitely not be able to escape the blame. Therefore, the three doctors only hoped that Colin could recognize the reality and give up this completely impossible method. "I know." Colin nodded, "You can go and rest. This experiment ends here." The three female doctors looked at each other and wanted to ask if Colin had completely given up this so-called cesarean section operation. However, looking at Colin's cold and expressionless face, no one dared to speak first. They could only anxiously bow and leave. Colin looked at the mess on the operation table and did not feel anything in his heart. The failure of the female doctors did not surprise him. With the underdeveloped surgical skills in this world, it would be a miracle if they could successfully perform a cesarean section. However, Colin still let the female doctors experiment a few times on the monkeys. It was not that he expected them to succeed, but to let them familiarize themselves with the position of the fetus in the mother's belly and how to remove the fetus through surgery. In this way, if Aisha really had a difficult birth, there would be an emergency plan. As for the failure of these experiments, Colin did not care. After all, blood loss or infection and other factors that could cause a cesarean section operation to fail were not a problem for vampires. Of course, this kind of cesarean section was just a precaution. Colin definitely hoped that this set of measures would not come in handy. Leaving the basement, Colin wanted to talk to Aisha, but when he reached the door of the palace, he found Duke Muller was waiting outside. "Earl, are you here to visit Her Majesty?" Duke Muller greeted with a flattering smile. Duke Muller was Aisha's brother. After the death of the previous Duke Muller, he inherited the title of the Miller family. "Yes." Colin nodded and asked in confusion, "Why don't you go in?" Duke Muller rubbed his hands and said awkwardly, "Mother is whispering to Her Majesty inside." Colin immediately understood. It was Duke Muller's mother, Madame Sharon, who was also Queen Aisha's mother. The mother and daughter were probably talking about things to take note of during childbirth. No wonder Duke Muller wanted to hide outside. Colin rubbed his nose. He knew that it wasn't a good time for him to go in, so he stood beside Duke Muller and thought about what to say to ease the awkward atmosphere. Fortunately, Duke Muller spoke first. "Earl, I heard that Silvermoon City hasn't been very peaceful recently." Colin glanced at him and asked with a smile, "What's not peaceful?" Seeing that Colin was asking the obvious, Duke Muller was a little anxious and didn't try to hide it anymore. "Earl, I don't believe that you haven't heard the news. Many nobles in Silvermoon City are secretly colluding with each other, preparing to rebel while Her Majesty is in labor and weak." "Oh." Colin immediately pretended to be shocked and asked, "You should report such an important matter to Her Majesty." "I already told Her Majesty. But I don't know what Her Majesty is thinking. She just won't listen to me." Duke Muller said bitterly. Earl, I know that Her Majesty has always been very respectful of you, so you should also advise Her Majesty. Colin stroked his chin and seemed to be moved. He asked, then, Duke Muller, according to what you said, what should Her Majesty do? First, she has to stabilize the Silvermoon Guard. Duke Muller blurted out. Her Majesty shouldn't hand over the command of the Silvermoon Guard to Duke Modowin at this critical juncture. You think that Duke Modowin will rebel? That's a possibility. After all, the House of Medea used to be the half-elven royal family. William Modowin didn't inherit the throne, so it's inevitable that he would resent Her Majesty. Colin nodded thoughtfully but didn't say anything. Duke Muller saw this and continued to agitate. Furthermore, Her Majesty actually let Duke Modowin take over the kingdom's political affairs. This military and political power is concentrated in one person's hands. Wouldn't that make Duke Modowin the de facto king of the half-elves? You have to know that the key to power is balance. Hearing Duke Muller ramble on about the balance of power, Colin secretly rolled his eyes. Of course, he knew what Aisha's brother was thinking. He was just jealous of Duke Modowin. However, to be honest, Colin could understand Duke Muller. After all, he was the Queen's brother and yet he was not favored by an outsider. It was natural for him to feel unbalanced. But this also showed that Duke Muller didn't see through Colin and Aisha's plan to lure the snake out of its hole. Otherwise, he wouldn't be envious of Duke Modowin's current position. It was a fire pit. Similarly, this also showed that Queen Aisha didn't reveal her plan to Duke Muller. Thinking of this, Colin couldn't help but narrow his eyes. It seemed that Aisha didn't trust her brother too much. Duke Muller was still patiently showing off his political views. Colin was annoyed and was about to change the topic. But at this moment, there was a sudden rush of footsteps behind him. Turning his head, Colin saw Queen Aisha's mother, Madame Sharon, running out in panic. Mother, what's wrong? Duke Muller hurriedly asked. Madame Sharon was half anxious and half excited as she shouted. Her Majesty is about to give birth. Chapter 379. As soon as Colin gave the order, a group of bloody cavalry surrounded the Queen's bedroom so tightly that not even a drop of water could trickle through. At the same time, there were also blood shadow guards guarding the place in the dark to ensure that Aisha's labor would not be disturbed by the outside world. 3 female doctors who were on standby were called over, and a group of trained maids immediately got to work. Some boiled water, some ironed cloth. Everything was carried out in an orderly manner. However, Colin and Duke Muller could not help in this busy situation. They could only stand outside the delivery room. Duke Muller walked around anxiously, looking at Colin's expression from time to time. He wanted to say something, but when he saw Colin's expressionless face, he swallowed his words. Time passed slowly. Duke Muller looked at the maids coming in and out to deliver all kinds of things. He heard the faint cries of pain coming from the delivery room. He could not help but ask, why hasn't she come out yet? Colin put his hands behind his back and looked at the setting sun with deep eyes. He said calmly, it's not that fast to give birth to a child. You're right, you're right. Duke Muller looked embarrassed. When he was about to say something, he suddenly stared at the sky in the north of the palace and exclaimed, smoke. Smoke. Why is there smoke? Colin also saw the direction Duke Muller was pointing at, but he did not look surprised. It was as if this was all within his expectations. In the blink of an eye, a few more plumes of thick smoke rose from Silvermoon City. And this seemed to be a signal. Suddenly, noisy noises could be heard everywhere in the city. Even Colin, who was far away in the palace, could vaguely hear it. What? What's going on? Duke Muller's forehead could not help but break out in a cold sweat. His eyes were filled with infinite fear. Obviously, he had realized that something was wrong. Colin could no longer keep silent. He shouted loudly, "Roger!" Knight Roger strode towards Colin and knelt down on one knee. "Sir, what can I do for you?" The corners of Colin's mouth curled up slightly, revealing a bloodthirsty smile. "This is the first battle after Bloody Cavalry changed its name. Don't let me down." Bang! Knight Roger slammed his left hand heavily on his chest armor and loudly said, "Yes." With that, he turned around and strode away. Duke Muller stared blankly at the scene before him. "Your lordship, did you foresee this from the start?" Colin turned around and smiled. "Duke, I'm not an idiot, how could I be unprepared?" Now, it was up to the rebels to see what tricks they could play. Hee, I hope it won't disappoint me too much." Duke Muller looked at Colin, who had a calm expression but was emitting a bloodthirsty aura. He couldn't help but shudder. At the same time, he sighed. Was Silver Moon City about to experience another night of bloodshed? Who is mobilizing the Silver Moon Guard? Why didn't I know? Duke Modwin roared angrily. Other than anger in his eyes, there was also a touch of unconcealable fear. In fact, he had long known about the undercurrents in Silver Moon City. He had reminded Queen Aisha to be careful many times, but unfortunately, the Queen had not paid attention to it. However, the Queen could ignore it, but as the commander of the Silver Moon Guard, Duke Modwin could not ignore some signs of rebellion in the army. So, he had been paying attention to the situation of the Silver Moon Guard. He had been chatting with the officers of the Guard, explaining the pros and cons to them, and warning them not to be fooled by some conspirators. Even so, when things came to a head, Duke Modwin realized in despair that a portion of the Silver Moon Guard was out of his control. "Your lordship, the Silver Moon Guard went to put out the fire, *T. Duke Modwin interrupted rudely. "I asked who mobilized the Silver Moon Guard, not why." The subordinate immediately shrunk his head and did not dare to make a sound. "Moreover, no matter what the reason is, shouldn't they have gotten my permission before mobilizing the Silver Moon Guard?" Duke Modwin roared angrily. He knew very well that putting out the fire was *T. No matter how big the fire was, there was no need to mobilize the Silver Moon Guard to save it. Those people mobilizing the Silver Moon Guard only had one goal, Queen Aisha. Thinking of this, Duke Modwin could no longer keep his cool. He kicked the subordinate in front of him to the ground and then strode out. But just as he stepped out, Duke Modwin was stopped. "Uncle Kamez?" Duke Modwin looked at the old man in front of him and had a bad feeling. Kamez Modwin stood with his hands behind his back and asked expressionlessly, "William, what are you going to do in such a hurry?" Duke Modwin took a deep breath and said honestly, "Uncle, someone mobilized the Silver Moon Guard without my permission. They have bad intentions. I have to stop them immediately." "No need." "What?" Kamez stared at Duke Modwin with his cloudy eyes and said calmly, "Because the person who mobilized the Silver Moon Guard is your son, Charlie." Duke Modwin was stunned as if he was struck by lightning. He was speechless for a long time. Seeing this, Kamez continued, "Don't even think about stopping them. Charlie is probably almost at the north gate of the palace and is ready to attack." Hearing this, the light in Duke Modwin's eyes disappeared. He asked painfully, "Why? Do you want the House of Medea to be destroyed?" "Destroyed? Hee. Kamez laughed coldly and said disdainfully, "William, have you forgotten how the House of Medea lost the half-elf throne? It was all because of your cowardice. Back then, as the first successor to the throne, you actually gave in to Colin and Aisha, that adulterous pair, and gave up the throne for nothing. This is a great humiliation. Do you know why Aisha dared to hand the Silver Moon Guard to you? Why did she dare to let you preside over the kingdom when she was about to give birth? Because she saw through you. She knew that you didn't dare to resist. The hatred, glory, and faith of the family have long been thrown aside. You only think about how to curry favor with Aisha. If we let you go on like this, the house of Medea will really fall into the abyss of destruction. Duke Modwin stared at his uncle as if he was getting to know him all over again. The corners of his mouth curled up slightly, revealing a mocking smile, and said, "Uncle, I admit that I'm not smart. Father has always been dissatisfied with me because of this. But do you know why he didn't change his successor when he was alive?" Camés was stunned, and asked, "Why?" "Because, although I'm stupid, but—" The mockery on Duke Modwin's face became more obvious, "But you are even more stupid." Camés' face flushed red, but he suppressed his anger and coldly snorted, "William, don't talk nonsense anymore. Do you have a choice now? Your only son, Charlie, is attacking the palace. Do you really think you can stay out of it? No, soon the nobles of Silvermoon City will think that you are the mastermind of this rebellion. Even if you do nothing now and watch Charlie get killed by the Blood Cavalry, do you really think you can continue to gain the trust of the Queen in the future?" Duke Modwin's face showed that he was struggling, but he still did not give in. Camés continued to persuade, "Charlie is your only son. Do you really have the heart to do that? We can't win against Count Angeli." Duke Modwin shouted in a low voice. "Humph. William, your cowardice disappoints me." Camés said coldly, "But, I can tell you that the participants of this rebellion are far more than you can imagine. Do you not even have the courage to take a gamble now?" Duke Modwin lowered his head, and his fingernails were already digging into his palms. Camés waited for a while, but did not receive any response from Duke Modwin. He was disappointed. But just as he was about to turn around and leave, ignoring the cowardly patriarch, Duke Modwin suddenly raised his head. His eyes were filled with a cold madness as he growled in a low voice. "All right. Then let's take another gamble." Chapter 380. Boom! The huge battering ram hit the thick north gate of the half-elven palace, shaking the whole palace wall and causing fine dust to fall down. "One more time. One more time and we can definitely break it open." Charlie waved his long sword and shouted loudly. His young face was full of excitement. Behind him, thousands of Silvermoon Guard officers and soldiers also raised their swords and cheered, waiting for the moment when the palace gate would be broken open. This scene seemed to be somewhat dark and humorous. Because the half-elven palace had always been guarded by the Silvermoon Guard. But at this moment, they became the party that was trying to break in. Since Colin entered the Silvermoon City, he immediately let the Blood Cavalry take over the defense of the palace, which led to this scene. Boom! The palace gate made of fine iron shook again, but it still stood stubbornly. However, the rebel army outside the palace gate suddenly became even more noisy because they could clearly see that spiderweb-like cracks had appeared on the walls around the palace gate. A strange sense of excitement was boiling in the rebel army's chest. Half-elven palace. The place they had sworn to guard with their lives. There were a lot of gold and silver treasures, young maids, and the beautiful half-elf queen. These seemed to be waving to them, luring them to rush into the place that used to be extremely majestic and sacred, to find everything they dreamed of and take it for themselves. But at this moment, a rebel army officer suddenly felt something strange. He turned around and looked in the direction behind him. Then, his eyes were quickly filled with fear. Cavalry, cavalry. It's the Blood Cavalry. Charlie was still immersed in the excitement of the palace gate being broken. When he heard the shouting of the officer next to him, he immediately said with dissatisfaction, "Why are you panicking? Don't we have a reserve team behind us?" However, just as they were talking, the Black Cavalry had appeared at the end of the road. The bright red flag was particularly dazzling. The wide main road outside the palace gave the cavalry room to perform. Before they saw the palace gate, the bloody cavalry lined up in 7 rows and galloped on the street without any scruples. Anyone who blocked their way and couldn't escape was knocked down to the ground and trampled into meat paste. At this time, no one could slow down their speed in front of them. The so-called innocent people were not in the consideration of these bloody cavalry soldiers. There was only one thing on their minds: when they reached the rebel army, they had to charge forward as fast as they could. Then, he would use the terrifying impact brought about by this speed to tear apart the enemy formation. It didn't take long for the sound of galloping horses to turn from vague to clear. When Charlie was still questioning why the reserve team behind him did not block this batch of cavalry, the vanguard of the bloody cavalry had been clearly seen. They all wore blood-red armor and held long sabers in their hands. They lined up in a neat and typical charging formation, filling up the entire long street. Even in the city, the soldiers of the bloody cavalry still carried out a full-speed charge with their superb horsemanship and courage. This kind of incomparably terrifying and incomparably crazy aura was something that no one who had not faced directly would ever be able to imagine. "Shield up! Shield up!" The rebel officer roared, but the desperation in his voice could not be concealed at all. Although they had been mentally prepared to confront the bloody cavalry, at this moment, facing the bloody cavalry that swept over like a gust of wind, the rebels could not help but begin to regret. Compared with the terrible threat in front of them, the various temptations in the palace seemed so pale and powerless. Boom! With countless screams, the first batch of heavy cavalry of the bloody cavalry crashed into the rebel army formation like steel monsters. Dozens of figures were immediately knocked out by the galloping horses. Blood sprayed like rain in the air, and the sound of bones breaking was heard. Even after the reorganization and expansion, the combat effectiveness of the bloody cavalry was still as unstoppable as before. They were like a sharp knife cutting into butter. Their speed was almost not reduced, and they tore a crack in the rebel army formation. With only one charge, the rebels who were full of killing desire immediately became chaotic. They desperately moved to both sides, and even squeezed in the direction of the palace gate that had not been knocked open, in order to avoid the terrible bloody cavalry behind them. Panic spread quickly like a plague. Charlie was still stupefied in the same place, as if he could not believe everything in front of him. Fortunately, the rebel officer beside him held him up by the waist, and decisively rushed to the alley in the east with a group of guards. The leader ran away, and the rebel army completely collapsed. In the open area in front of the palace gate, there were chaotic crowds everywhere. There were still some quick-witted rebels who quickly put down their weapons and shouted that they wanted to surrender. Unfortunately, they collapsed too fast, and the bloody cavalry general did not have time to change the order. So, those bloody cavalry soldiers, like hungry wolves rushing into a flock of sheep, skillfully bent down, waved their swords, and cut the rebels on the side of the horses to the ground row by row with the help of the horses. Countless blood sprayed into the air and sprinkled to the ground. Thousands of cavalrymen galloped through the street in front of the palace gate, leaving corpses and flowing blood on the ground. Crack! The crumbling palace gate slowly opened, and Knight Roger slowly walked out. His indifferent eyes swept over the messy battlefield, but he did not give the order to withdraw his swords. After listening to the cavalry general's report on the situation in the city, Knight Roger thought for a moment and ordered, "Don't care about those warehouses that are on fire, concentrate our forces to suppress the rebel Silvermoon Guard, and find out the mastermind of this rebellion." An officer carefully reminded, "Sir, those places that are on fire are all granaries. I suspect that someone wants to destroy the food in Silvermoon City. If we don't do anything, then the purpose of this trip." Knight Roger firmly shook his head and said, "No, those granaries are a trap to disperse our forces, don't be fooled. Our priority is to suppress the rebellion, the food problem is not something you should worry about." "Yes, Charlie." Duke Modwin looked at his son who was kneeling in front of him in a trance, the anger in his heart dissipated instantly, and the words of reproach could not come out of his mouth. Even if he knew that he was dragged into the water by his son, Duke Modwin also understood at this time that he had no way out. Under his order, almost all the Silvermoon Guard had been mobilized, and they were constantly gathering at the palace, ready to fight to the death with the blood cavalry. This time, the House of Medea had put all their assets on the line, and whether they could regain the half-elf throne or not, success or failure depended on this. William, the Blood Cavalry is already prepared, and their combat power is really terrifying, we have to avoid them. Kamei looked at Charlie's sorry appearance and reminded him with lingering fear. Uncle, do you have any good suggestions? We can't attack the palace now, the Blood Cavalry must have deployed a lot of troops there, and the streets outside the palace are too wide, the cavalry can rush up. So, we should split up and deploy the troops in the dense areas of the city, so that we can limit the cavalry. Duke Modwin thought for a while and asked, but what if the Blood Cavalry is entrenched in the palace, and they don't come out to fight with us? Kamei sneered and said, they won't, don't forget that the half-elf merchants are burning the granaries now, that is the important purpose of Earl Angeli's trip. The northern frontier needs this batch of food, otherwise, there will be a famine this year. So, the Blood Cavalry can't just sit there and watch the city burn, they will definitely come out. Duke Modwin nodded and said, well, let's do as you said. Chapter 381. The night was getting darker. The sound of killing was heard everywhere in Silvermoon City, and the fire was soaring to the sky. The Silvermoon Guard, who used to be the keeper of order, had become the source of chaos at this time. For the granaries that were on fire, not only did they not put out the fire, they even stopped the people who tried to put out the fire, allowing the fire to spread. Such abnormal behavior made the residents of Silvermoon City immediately realize that something was wrong. Then they connected the sound of killing and the corpses and blood that could be seen everywhere on the streets. The word rebellion suddenly came into the minds of many half-elves. So, the panic quickly swept the whole city and intensified the chaos. In the face of all this, the Blood Cavalry did not act rashly. They first firmly guarded the half-elven palace, then divided the troops to control the 4 city gates and the main roads in Silvermoon City. But they did not go deep into the inconvenient alleys. As for the granaries that were on fire, they ignored them. Under the connivance of both sides, the fire became bigger and gradually spread to the surrounding houses. Cries for help, and screams were endless. This was destined to be a chaotic and bloody night. After losing the most basic order, the suppressed ugliness was gradually exposed. Those who used to be submissive had all picked up their weapons. Those who were well-behaved had now become exceptionally ferocious. Those who had enmity with each other immediately fought each other. Those who called themselves brothers had also turned against each other in the end. Blood flowed wantonly in the night. Life, which was already extremely lowly in this chaotic world, became even cheaper. This was no doubt a sinful carnival. In the face of all this, the Blood Cavalry finally could not sit still. Knight Roger did not expect that the rebels were more cunning and vicious than he had imagined. Now it seemed that they would rather burn the entire Silvermoon City and let countless half-elves die in this chaos to force the Blood Cavalry to fight with them in the streets. Of course, Knight Roger was reluctant to let the precious cavalry dismount to fight in the streets. But as time went by, he could not hold on anymore. He couldn't really let the food in Silvermoon City be burned. Otherwise, the winter in the northern frontier would be very difficult to endure this year. So, he finally gave the order to march to the fire. Following this order, batches of bloody cavalry soldiers flowed into the streets of Silvermoon City like trickles. The Silvermoon Guards, who had been waiting for a long time, rushed out one after another. Both sides immediately engaged in a dangerous and tragic melee. At this point, the bloody battle in Silvermoon City had reached its climax. At the same time, Queen Aisha's labor had entered a critical period. In the delivery room, Madame Sharon held her daughter's hand tightly with one hand and kept wiping the sweat on her forehead with the other. "Aisha, come on, come on." On the bed, Queen Aisha's face was pale, and she was sweating profusely. She gritted her teeth and did her best for the birth of her child. However, judging from the expression of the female doctor in charge of the delivery, the progress was not smooth. "How is it?" "Ah." Madame Sharon turned around and asked anxiously. Madam, Her Majesty, looking at the doctor's hesitant look, Madame Sharon became more anxious. She quickly took out a tube of medicine from her arms and said to Queen Aisha, Aisha, this is the energy medicine that I bought at a high price. Drink it quickly. Queen Aisha panted a few times, but shook her head and said, no need, mother, I still have strength, don't force yourself at this time. Come on, drink it. Queen Aisha firmly pushed Madame Sharon's hand away and said, the palace also prepared energy medicine, I'll drink that. The female doctor quickly took out a tube of medicine from the medicine box and said, yes, madam, we also prepared energy medicine. Madame Sharon frowned and said, it's okay, it's the same. Come on, Aisha, drink the medicine. As she spoke, she sent the energy medicine that she had prepared to Queen Aisha's mouth. The female doctor reminded her softly, but madam, Her Majesty can't drink things outside the palace. Madame Sharon was instantly angry. She turned around and scolded, what do you mean? Are you doubting me? The female doctor shrank back in fear and quickly shook her head. No, I don't dare. Seeing this, Queen Aisha panted and said, Mother, don't blame her. This is the rule of the palace. Everything I eat and drink has to be tried first. Madame Sharon glanced at her daughter and could only nod. All right, then I won't trouble you. You should drink the medicine prepared by the palace. The female doctor heaved a sigh of relief and quickly went forward to let Queen Aisha drink the energy medicine prepared by the palace. After that, Queen Aisha's face was visibly rosy. It seemed that the medicine was very effective. Aisha, use more strength, use more strength. Madame Sharon encouraged again. However, as time passed, the situation did not improve. The female doctor who delivered the child became more and more anxious, and she wanted to say something several times but stopped. Seeing this, Madame Sharon could no longer suppress the anxiety in her heart. She immediately got up and personally went to the end of the bed, wanting to check on Queen Aisha's condition. Although she had never delivered a child, Madame Sharon had given birth to 3 children herself, so it was impossible for her to not know anything about this. Therefore, when she lifted the sheet and saw the situation below Aisha, she was stunned. Aisha, why is there no movement in your cervix, is that so? Mother. Queen Aisha said indifferently. At the same time, she sat up straight. The painful expression on her face completely disappeared, as if everything that had happened just now was just an illusion. Madame Sharon was stunned, clearly not understanding what was going on. Queen Aisha looked at her mother with bright eyes and said in a deep voice, Mother, perhaps your energy medicine can help me. Why don't you take it out and let someone try it first before giving it to me to drink? Madame Sharon opened her mouth and said with a shocked expression, You're not going to give birth at all, are you? Queen Aisha did not answer her mother's question. She continued to ask stubbornly, Mother, where's your energy medicine? Take it out. Since you're not going to give birth, of course, there's no need to drink that medicine. No, Mother, I want to drink it, Queen Aisha said in a tone that left no room for doubt. The doctors and maids in the delivery room were also stunned by the changes in front of them. Her Majesty the Queen was actually pretending to give birth. Although they could not understand why the Queen was doing this, they could clearly feel the strange atmosphere. They all lowered their heads in silence, not daring to make a sound. Under Queen Aisha's stern gaze, Madame Sharon's expression became more and more unsightly. However, she did not dare to take out the energy medicine from before. Mother, when father wanted to marry me into the royal family, I begged you, but you rejected me directly and even told me, as a child of the Miller family, I have the responsibility to contribute to the prosperity of the family, even if the price is my lifetime of happiness. Queen Aisha stared at her mother, deep disappointment and mockery flashing in her eyes. She continued, So, Mother, what price are you going to make me pay for the prosperity of the Miller family this time? Madame Sharon trembled and weakly defended herself, Aisha. What do you mean by this, medicine. Queen Aisha said coldly. You haven't given birth yet. Why do you need medicine? Madame Sharon was still playing dumb. However, this kind of stubborn resistance was destined to be futile. Silently, an armored man whose face could not be seen clearly appeared behind Madame Sharon and reached out to lift her up. You! What are you doing? Aisha, Aisha! You can't do this. I'm your mother. Your biological mother. However, not only did these words not evoke Aisha's sympathy, but it also made her eyes even colder. The armored man took out the medicine from Madame Sharon's arms and handed it to the doctor beside him. Queen Aisha's cold order came at the same time. Go and check if there's any problem. The doctor trembled as he took the medicine and said, Yes, Your Majesty. Chapter 382. The Temple of Destiny was located in the east of Silvery Moon City. It wasn't in a remote location, but it was exceptionally quiet. It could even be said to be deserted. Many evergreen cypress trees with straight trunks had been transplanted around the temple. They were like silent soldiers, surrounding and protecting the Temple of Destiny, creating a solemn and dignified atmosphere. In fact, when the temple was first built, it hadn't been so quiet. There was an endless stream of half-elves who came to pray, and the bustling scene was even more exaggerated than the most bustling market. However, as the elves disappeared from the radiant moon forest, the half-elves gradually moved closer to the powerful human empires. Their faith leaned more and more towards the radiant god, and not the goddess of destiny. Hence, it was understandable that the Temple of Destiny was neglected. The main building of the temple was made of low-key limestone, occupying an area of 8,000 square meters. The huge prayer hall was 45 meters wide and 120 meters long. The dome in the middle was 50 meters high, and it could accommodate tens of thousands of people praying at the same time. However, such a grand occasion hadn't occurred in a long time. Now, the prayer hall was empty. Even if there were servants cleaning it every day, it was difficult to completely clean up the dust that had accumulated. Silvery Moon City was shrouded in blood and fire tonight, but the Temple of Destiny was still as quiet as before. Whether it was the rebels or the rebels, even if they no longer believed in the goddess of destiny, they wouldn't blaspheme this place. On the balcony at the top of the tower, a beautiful half-elf woman was leaning against the railing, looking at the flames in Silvery Moon City in a daze. She wore a green ceremonial robe, quietly hiding her slender figure. Her exposed skin was white and lustrous, as if it was covered in a layer of bright silver moonlight. However, there was a lingering sadness and pity between her brows. The night breeze blew through her soft hair, creating a sad melody that sounded like she was weeping and complaining. High Priestess Trisolai, have you thought it through? Marquis Vincent walked out from the shadows behind Trisolai, his voice carrying some suppressed impatience and annoyance. Trisolai didn't turn her head when she heard this. She was still staring at the flames not far away, as if she hadn't heard the question of the noble Marquis from the east. Marquis Vincent snorted and said angrily, High Priestess, don't think that this ceremony has to be done by you. You may not know this, but in the past few days, several of your priests have approached me and are willing to help me complete this ritual. Hearing this, there was finally some fluctuation in Trisolai's eyes. She slowly turned around and faced Marquis Vincent. She said calmly and confidently, Lord Marquis, but you also know that the chances of success will be the highest if I personally preside over this ritual. But if you're not willing, the probability is always 0 to me. If that's the case, why don't I let someone else have a try? Marquis Vincent took a step forward and said coldly. However, Your Excellency High Priestess, you have to think this through. If someone else were to help me complete this ritual, then I'm afraid that you, the High Priestess of Silvermoon City, will have to abdicate your position. Trisilly's expression was still indifferent, as if she didn't care about Marquis Vincent's threats. She reached out to tuck her messy hair behind her ears, revealing her swan-like slender neck. Marquis Vincent couldn't help but swallow his saliva, but he didn't act rashly. He remembered that before he left, his father had cautioned him that the only thing he had to be careful of in Silvermoon City was this mysterious high priestess of the goddess of destiny. Lord Marquis. Trisilae finally spoke, "It's not that I don't want to help you, but I find it hard to believe that you have the ability to fulfill the promises you made." A trace of anger flashed across Marquis Vincent's face. He said in a deep voice, "Your Excellency High Priestess, I represent the will of my father, the Duke of the Eastern Region. I won't go back on the promises I made to you." "Is that so?" Trisilae was unmoved. She asked back, "Then what about your mother? Will the Archbishop of the Eastern Region of the Radiance Church really agree to let the Temple of Destiny lead the faith of the Half-Elven Kingdom?" "Of course my mother will agree. I've already asked for her opinion on this matter," Marquis Vincent said with certainty. Seeing that Trisilae was still hesitant, Marquis Vincent spoke again. "Your Excellency High Priestess, perhaps in your eyes, the faith of more than 1,000,000 half-elves is very precious, but in the eyes of the Radiance Church, it isn't that important. Moreover, this is the promise of the House of Saint Prospero to you. This is also your only chance to save the Temple of Destiny and restore it to its former glory. If you miss this chance, you can only continue to bitterly wait in this place where no one cares about the hope of salvation. So, what are you still hesitating for?" Trisilae shook her head and said, "If the House of Saint Prospero is really sincere, then please give me some more specific conditions. It shouldn't be an empty promise like, 'Let the Temple of Destiny lead the faith of the half-elves' or something similar." Marquis Vincent took a deep breath and suppressed the impatience in his heart. He asked in a deep voice, "Then, Your Excellency High Priestess, what conditions do you want?" Trisilae gave a sweet smile. She raised her finger and said, "First, the number of priests of the Radiance Church in the Half-Elven Kingdom must be less than 100. Second, 10% of the tax revenue of the Half-Elven Kingdom must be handed over to the Temple of Destiny. Third, the Half-Elven King or Queen must convert to the Goddess of Destiny. Fourth." Hearing Trisilae's harsh conditions, Marquis Vincent's expression didn't change. However, he was laughing in his heart. In his opinion, this high priestess of the Temple of Destiny was so naive that it was cute. When Trisilae finished speaking, Marquis Vincent didn't even try to bargain. He immediately agreed, "All right, I agree on behalf of the House of Saint Prospero." Trisilae's amber eyes stared at Marquis Vincent, as if she really believed him. A smile finally appeared on her pretty face. "All right then. I'll help you host the bloodline ceremony. However, I hope you understand that even I can't guarantee that the ceremony will succeed." "I understand." Marquis Vincent was overjoyed. He nodded and said, "However, I must remind you that the conditions you requested will only take effect if the ceremony succeeds." "Of course. If the ceremony fails, then the House of Saint Prospero will no longer have the final say in Silverymoon City." Marquis Vincent snorted when he heard this. He seemed to be unhappy about this. Trisilae didn't care about Marquis Vincent's feelings at all. She asked in a crisp voice, "All right, where's the Phoenix Soul Stone fragment?" Marquis Vincent hurriedly took out an exquisite small box from his bosom and slowly opened it. A gorgeous multicolored radiance spread out like flowing water, making everything on the balcony seem like a beautiful dream. Trisilae's gaze was fixed on the Phoenix Soul Stone fragment. Her expression instantly became very sincere. "High Priestess, how about this Phoenix Soul Stone fragment at the House of Saint Prospero collected? It should be able to help you complete the ceremony smoothly, right?" Marquis Vincent proudly boasted. Trisilae ignored Marquis Vincent's question. She walked with profound steps towards the Phoenix Soul Stone fragment. She lowered her head and bowed, respectfully performing an ancient ceremony. Then, she gently held it with both hands. When she raised her head again, this beautiful high priestess of the Goddess of Destiny was already in tears. Chapter 383. Half-Elven Palace. Duke Muller noticed that his sister's cries had suddenly stopped coming from the delivery room. He was puzzled and asked, "Why is there no sound? Has she already given birth?" But after a while, he shook his head and muttered to himself, "That can't be right. I didn't hear the baby crying either." Colin, who had been silent all this time, finally turned around. With a strange smile on his face, he said to Duke Muller, "What did the Eastern region promise you?" "What?" Duke Muller was shocked, his face full of astonishment. Colin didn't say anything. He just looked at Duke Muller, his eyes full of ridicule as if his prey had taken the bait. Duke Muller calmed down and pretended to be relaxed as he said, "Your Excellency, should we go in and see what's going on inside?" "What do you think is going on inside?" Colin asked with a smile. "This. How would I know? If it's convenient, we should go in and take a look, then what do you want to see inside?" Of course I want to see Aisha give birth to a healthy baby." Duke Muller tried to maintain a relaxed tone. But Colin still caught a hint of fear and panic in Duke Muller's eyes. "Unfortunately, I'm afraid your expectations will be disappointed." Colin pretended to sigh, as if he really felt sorry for Duke Muller. "Why?" "Because Her Majesty isn't going to give birth." Colin finished speaking and crossed his arms in front of his chest. He stared at Duke Muller with interest, waiting for his reaction. Duke Muller opened his mouth wide and laughed awkwardly, Your Excellency. You must be joking with me, I'm not joking with you." Colin stopped smiling and his tone became serious. "This was originally a test that Her Majesty and I discussed. We wanted to see what kind of big fish we could catch." "Haha, who would have thought that Duke Muller would be able to fish you out?" "Count, I don't quite understand what you mean." Duke Muller was still stubbornly resisting. Colin sneered. "Duke Muller, did you know? I especially like to watch the prey struggle in the trap. Every time they make a futile struggle for survival, it's so moving, yet so foolish and laughable." Duke Muller could no longer maintain his composure. Beads of cold sweat appeared on his forehead, and his body began to tremble uncontrollably. He opened his mouth, wanting to explain himself, but he didn't know what to say. Colin didn't seem to want to listen to Duke Muller's explanation. He continued, "Actually, from the very beginning, I've been very curious about the true killer move of the rebels in Silvermoon City. Those half-elf merchants obviously couldn't do it. Even if they had the courage to burn all their food, so what? At most, the northern frontier would be more difficult this winter, but they couldn't change the situation in Silvermoon City. As for the Silvermoon Guard, with the Blood Cavalry in the city, what chance did they have to win? Even if they hid in the alleys and took advantage of the terrain to make the Blood Cavalry lose their biggest advantage, so what? Even if the Blood Cavalry got off their horses, they were still the best of the best. Maybe they couldn't win easily, but if the Silvermoon Guard thought that they could defeat the Blood Cavalry, they were too naive. So, I realized early that the rebels must have a true killer move. Otherwise, they wouldn't have dared to jump out and court death. So, what is this killer move?" Speaking of this, Colin slowly approached Duke Muller. The latter couldn't bear his sharp eyes and extremely oppressive momentum and had to lower his head. "In order to figure this out, Aisha and I planned this scene together. She pretended to be in labor and let the rebels believe that she was at her weakest moment. At this time, I could see their trump card clearly. But I didn't expect that the trump card of the rebels was the Miller family." In the face of Colin's blunt accusation, Duke Muller lowered his head and kept silent, as if he had admitted it. Colin didn't care and continued with a smile, "But to be honest, I wasn't too surprised about this. Since you could use Aisha as a tool for marriage and forced her to marry an old king who had one foot in the grave, it meant that in your heart, you didn't treat her as a family member. So this time, you didn't hesitate to continue sacrificing Aisha. If Aisha gave birth to an accident, then Duke Muller, you should be able to smoothly inherit the half-elf throne, right? You think I'm doing this for the throne?" Duke Muller finally raised his head and angrily glared at Colin as he roared in a low voice. "Oh. What is it for?" Colin asked with great interest. "I'm doing this for the half-elf kingdom," Duke Muller said with a strong sense of righteousness. "Heh," Colin couldn't help but laugh out loud. In the face of Colin's ridicule, Duke Muller clenched his fists and said firmly, "Colin Angeli. Why don't you think about it? Why did this rebellion cause such a big commotion? Almost all the half-elf nobles, generals, soldiers, and merchants are rebelling. Because they know that Aisha, that bitch, isn't worthy of being the half-elf king. She's just a puppet you use to control the half-elves. As long as she's on the throne, the interests of the half-elves will never be guaranteed." "Is that so?" Colin rubbed his chin and lightly asked, "Then tell me, how did we infringe on the interests of the half-elves?" "You forcefully bought the half-elves' food at a low price, but the East asked you to destroy all the food, at least I was willing to pay. You forcefully dispatched the Silvermoon Guard and let the half-elves bleed and sacrifice for you. The Silvermoon Guard is only helping me guard my territory at the northern frontier. I didn't send them to fight any hard battles, and I didn't use them as cannon fodder. Humph, no matter how you quibble, the half-elf kingdom is now a puppet in your hands." "Hee, then respected Duke Muller, if you ascend the throne, won't you become a puppet in the hands of the East?" "I." Duke Muller's face turned red, and he couldn't refute for a while. Colin coldly smiled and disdainfully said, "What do you mean for the half-elf kingdom? That's just an excuse to appease your conscience. Without it, you won't be able to sleep peacefully at night, right? Since it's for the sake of fighting for power, then say it openly. That way, I'll think more highly of you. However, as long as you participate in this game of power, then when you lose, other than admitting it openly, any other excuses will only make you a joke." After saying this, Colin turned around and walked into the delivery room. At the same time, 2 armored men silently appeared behind Duke Muller and restrained him. Duke Muller struggled with all his might and at the same time begged Colin for mercy, Sir Count, Sir Count. I admit defeat, I admit defeat. You can't kill me, you can't kill me. I'm Aisha's brother, her brother. Chi. A cold light flashed, and Duke Muller's shouts came to an abrupt end. With a thud, a bloody head rolled to the ground. In the delivery room, Madame Sharon had already fainted, not knowing whether it was because of fear or shame. Seeing Colin walk in, Queen Aisha, who was leaning on the bed, revealed a bright smile. Just as she was about to say something, she suddenly saw the night sky outside the window suddenly light up. Colin also looked out in surprise. The dark night sky turned fiery red in an instant, as if the fire in the city had spread to the sky. But of course, Colin knew that the fire on the ground couldn't reach the sky. Just as he was about to walk out to take a closer look, the phantom of a golden phoenix suddenly rushed out of the heavenly fire. With the power to look down on the world, this phantom of a phoenix passed through the vast night sky before anyone could react. It rapidly circled above the half-elven palace before turning into specks of starlight and gradually dissipating. Colin frowned. Just as he was about to ask, he saw Queen Elsa press on her stomach with a pained expression. "Colin, it seems like I'm really going to give birth this time." Chapter 384. They had just experienced a maneuver, so when it came to the real thing this time, the people in the delivery room were not too nervous. They just habitually did their own jobs. Only Colin began to be anxious. Ah! Listening to the cry of Aisha from the delivery room and watching the maids coming in and out to deliver various things, Colin stood at the gate of the palace stupidly, but he felt that all this was a bit unreal. But this time, it was indeed real. The wonder in the night sky had disappeared, but the shadow of the phoenix was still lingering in Colin's mind, making him faintly uneasy. What a coincidence! The shadow of the phoenix appeared and disappeared in a flash over the palace, and then Aisha was about to give birth. Although the sequence of time did not necessarily mean the connection of cause and effect, Colin found it hard to believe that there was no relationship between the two. Could it be that this was the real killing move of the rebel forces? But Colin found that he could not understand the opponent's move at all. What was the shadow of the phoenix? What impact did it have on Aisha and the child in her belly? Without knowing these, Colin did not know how to deal with it. He could only pray that his worries were superfluous and Aisha could give birth smoothly. However, as time went by, Colin's heart kept sinking. The glimmer of dawn tore through the dark night and sprinkled the first ray of sunshine in the half-elven palace. The battle in the city had not yet stopped, but according to Knight Roger's report, the bloody cavalry was gradually gaining the upper hand, and it was believed that it would not be long before they could completely suppress the rebellion of the Silvermoon Guard. But Colin was not happy, because the child was still not born smoothly, and Aisha's voice was getting weaker and weaker. Finally, Colin could not bear it anymore and strode into the delivery room. It was reasonable to say that an outsider like Colin should not enter the delivery room of Queen Aisha, but in the current situation, no one dared to say anything. Moreover, everyone was well aware of the true relationship between Colin and Aisha. What's going on? Colin's heart ached when he saw Queen Aisha lying on the bed with a pale face and drenched in sweat. Count, His Majesty. His Majesty doesn't have any strength. The female doctor looked at the gloomy Colin and said carefully. Colin glared at him and said anxiously, "What do you mean by no strength? Didn't you use energy serums?" "Yes, His Majesty has already finished 3 bottles of energy potions, but," Colin frowned as he realized that something was wrong. Theoretically, as a knight, Aisha should be much stronger than other pregnant women. How could she be so weak during labor? Moreover, Aisha's spirit and energy were still so weak after drinking so many energy elixirs. There was clearly something wrong with her. "Colin!" Queen Aisha shouted weakly. Colin quickly sat by the bed and held Aisha's hand, comforting her gently, "Don't worry, you'll be fine." Aisha shook her head slowly and said, "No, I'm afraid I won't be able to give birth to this child. Don't be silly. Listen to me. I can feel, the child's aura is too strong." "What do you mean? Do you remember the phoenix illusion you saw last night?" "Yes, what is that?" "That's the totem of the High Elves." Colin knew about this. It was said that the blood of the legendary mythical beast, the phoenix, flowed in the High Elves' bodies. Therefore, their king was called the Phoenix King, and the palace they built in Imperial Dragon City was also called the Phoenix Palace. However, he did not understand why the phoenix illusion appeared in Silvermoon City, and what did it have to do with Aisha's labor. Before he could ask, Queen Aisha continued, "The phoenix bloodline is the symbol of the High Elves' royal family, and the child in my stomach is probably of the phoenix bloodline. I don't know how a half-elf like me could give birth to the phoenix bloodline that even the High Elves' royal family treasures, but, such a strong bloodline is beyond my ability to bear. It's constantly absorbing my strength, and I can't give birth to it at all." Hearing this, Colin could already confirm that the phoenix illusion was the work of the rebel army. They had used some mysterious method to forcefully increase the bloodline of the child in Aisha's stomach. Originally, giving birth to a child with the phoenix bloodline was a joyous occasion. However, the problem was that Aisha herself was a half-elf, and such a bloodline that was extremely lowly for the High Elves was not enough to naturally give birth to the phoenix bloodline. Hence, to her, the baby in her womb was a huge burden. If this went on, the child would suck all of Aisha's life force dry. Even if she was a blood descendant, she would not be spared. So this was the rebel army's real killer move. Thinking of this, Colin immediately made up his mind and said in a low voice, "Since it can't be born, we'll cut it out." Of course, Aisha understood what Colin meant. She knew about the cesarean section that Colin had prepared. At first, she thought that Colin's actions were superfluous, but she did not expect it to come in handy now. "No, don't." However, Aisha did not agree. She shook her head and begged, "If we do this, our child will die, don't be silly. If you die, will the child live? We can wait a little longer. I can feel that his breath is stabilizing. Maybe I can hold on a little longer, but Aisha, why do we have to take this risk? Colin gently kissed Aisha's smooth forehead. As long as you're alive, we can still have another child. But the child we have in the future can't be said to be the old king's posthumous child. His identity, so what? Colin said domineeringly. Even if he's an illegitimate child, I can still help him ascend to the half-elf throne. But. Aisha believed in Colin, but as a mother, she could not bear to part with her child. However, Colin knew that he had to harden his heart and make this difficult choice for Aisha. He looked at the tearful Aisha and gritted his teeth. Don't worry, Aisha. We will definitely take revenge for this. After saying that, he ordered the 3 female doctors who were standing at the end of the bed. Do it. Cut the child out. Earl. The female doctor was so scared that her whole body trembled. Hurry up. But Earl. None of the previous experiments have succeeded, clang. Colin pulled out the sharp sword at his waist and pointed it at the female doctor. He growled, do as I say, or you will be the ones to die. The female doctor looked at the ferocious face of Colin and the sword that was almost at her throat. Finally, she gritted her teeth and took out the scalpel that she had prepared in advance. She whispered a few prayers, and then under Colin's urging, she used her trembling hands to cut open Aisha's belly. Chapter 385. Newborns were ugly. However, it was not enough to scare the experienced female doctor. However, she could not help but tremble as she held the baby girl in her arms. This was because the baby girl did not cry. The female doctor lifted the baby girl by her feet and slapped her back repeatedly, but it was to no avail. The delivery room was dead silent. The doctors and maids here were of course veterans, with rich experience in delivering babies. They might not understand the scientific principle behind the crying of newborns, but there was one thing they were very clear about: a baby that did not cry was a dead baby. Colin stopped the doctor who was still slapping the baby mechanically and ordered, "You may leave." The doctors were relieved and hurriedly bowed and left, as if they were afraid that Colin would suddenly change his mind. Aisha had already fainted, but that was only because she did not have enough energy. Her life was not in danger. What Colin was really worried about was his newborn daughter. Although he had already made the decision to save the mother, when he ordered the doctors to perform a cesarean section, he also realized that it would be difficult for his daughter to survive if she were to suddenly leave her mother's body with an unstable bloodline. However, when he saw the wrinkled little life in front of him with his own eyes, the feeling of being connected by blood still made Colin's heart tremble, and he could not control himself. At this moment, there was only one thing in his mind: to save her at all costs. However, what surprised him was that his child with Aisha was not a blood kin. Therefore, Colin immediately thought that if he were to turn her into a blood kin now, would he be able to save her from this near-death state? However, what made Colin hesitate was that if he were to bite his daughter now, she would only become a blood thrall and not a blood kin. This was because Colin could only turn a knight into a blood kin. Obviously, this newborn baby girl was not a knight. Even if he immediately found a priest to baptize her, it would be too late. However, Colin only hesitated for a moment before lowering his head and biting. Even if this child became a blood thrall, it would be better than becoming a corpse. However, the development of the situation once again exceeded Colin's expectations. When he bit open a wound on his daughter's small neck and sucked some blood, he unexpectedly discovered that there was a suction force coming from his daughter's wound. Colin was overjoyed at this unexpected good news. This was because he knew that this was a unique process of the embrace ritual to transform a blood descendant. Transforming a blood thrall would not cause this kind of reverse suction. But the problem was that his daughter wasn't a knight. How could she trigger the conditions for the embrace? Could it be because of her special bloodline? Colin suddenly realized that perhaps the trigger for the embrace was not a profession, but a bloodline. Could it be that the bloodline of the knights was somehow similar to the phoenix bloodline of the high elves? While he was thinking, Colin's blood flowed into the baby girl's body through the fangs. Slowly, wisps of blood-red smoke floated out of their bodies. These wisps of smoke seemed to be alive, condensing into mysterious and profound patterns in the air. In his daze, waves of low and deep voices that sounded like sleep-talking reverberated in Colin's ears. Outside the half-elven palace, the battle was still going on. However, the blood cavalry had already gained the upper hand. They were reducing the space for the Silver Moon Guard to move. At the same time, they were trying to save the burning granary to prevent the fire from spreading. However, at this moment, a slim figure suddenly appeared in front of the palace gate. "Stop!" An officer of the blood cavalry rode forward and stopped the woman. Although the half-elf woman in front of him looked weak and posed no threat, the fact that she could pass through the chaotic Silver Moon City and come to the palace alone while facing the murderous blood cavalry showed that this half-elf woman was definitely not simple. "General, I'm the Grand Priestess of the Temple of Fate in the Silver Moon City. I want to see Count Angeli." Trisilae took off the thin veil on her face and said in a clear voice. The officer did not know Trisilae. Her beautiful face under the thin veil made him lose focus for a second. However, he quickly recovered and said in a cold tone, "Sorry, Grand Priestess." "I'm sorry, Your Excellency High Priest. The Count has ordered that no one is allowed to enter the half-elf palace." Trisilae did not give up after hearing the officer's words. She continued, "General, it's about the life of the Queen and her baby. Please make an exception." The officer frowned and hesitated for a second. He said, "Please wait for a second." After saying that, he rode back to the palace. After a while, the gate of the palace opened again. Knight Roger rode his horse to Trisilae and questioned, "You said that the Queen and her baby are in danger?" "Yes." Trisilae said with certainty, "If I'm not wrong, the Queen should be having a difficult labor now." Knight Roger looked at the Grand Priestess in front of him and nodded, "All right, follow me." Trisilae smiled and jumped onto a warhorse handed to her by a soldier. She followed Knight Loki and galloped into the depths of the palace. Just as they were about to reach the Queen's chamber, a loud cry of a baby suddenly sounded and spread through half of the palace. Hearing this sound, the courtiers, guards, and maids in the palace all shouted excitedly. A festive atmosphere immediately enveloped the entire palace. Only Trisilae's expression changed greatly, as if she had seen something unbelievable. Knight Roger was also immersed in this intense joy, so he didn't notice that something was wrong with Trisilae. By the time he turned around, Chui Silly had already put on a warm smile and congratulated him, "Your Majesty, congratulations on your successful delivery. Since that's the case, there's no need for me to disturb her." However, Knight Roger was keenly aware of the Grand Priestess's abnormality. He immediately smiled and said, "Grand Priestess, since you're already here, you should at least meet with the Queen and the Count. Please wait a moment, I'll go inform them." After saying that, Knight Roger ignored Trisilae's urging and strode into the chamber. In the chamber, Aisha was also startled awake by the baby girl's cries. She struggled to get up and weakly called out, "Colin, where's our child? Don't worry, she's here." Colin gently picked up his daughter and placed her in Aisha's arms. Aisha took the baby girl who was still crying. Her face was instantly filled with tears of joy. Seeing this heartwarming scene, Colin's heart was filled with warmth. At this moment, he felt that his connection with this world had increased by another layer. There was one more person in this world that was worthy of his protection. However, this heartwarming moment was interrupted by a series of footsteps. "Sir, there's a Grand Priestess of the Temple of Fate outside requesting an audience." Knight Roger loudly reported through the curtain. "No." Colin replied without turning his head. At this moment, he couldn't be bothered to pay attention to some Grand Priestess. Knight Roger did not leave and instead spoke again. Sir, this Grand Priestess once said that the Queen's labor would be dangerous. Oh. Colin's interest was piqued. At the same time, he also thought that the Grand Priestess of the Goddess of Fate might be related to that Phoenix projection. Perhaps, Aisha's difficult labor crisis was caused by this guy, which was why she appeared in the palace so coincidentally. But why did she walk right into the trap? Thinking of this, Colin narrowed his eyes, a dangerous glint could be seen in his eyes. She's still outside? Yes, she seemed to want to retreat after hearing the baby's cries, but I didn't let her leave. Very good. Colin kissed Aisha's and his daughter's foreheads and gently said, You two have a good rest, I'm going to settle the score with a certain someone. Aisha lightly nodded and said, but you have to be careful. This Grand Priestess Trisalai's background is mysterious, she might not be easy to deal with. Colin stood up and coldly said, Don't worry, no matter who did this, they will pay the price. Chapter 386. In the guest hall, Colin quietly looked at the High Priestess of the Goddess of Destiny in front of him, his eyes flashing. She was a rather beautiful half-elf. She had emerald green hair, amber eyes, and exquisite facial features. She was like a classical sculpture in a palace that had come to life. Her temperament was cold and elegant, but she also revealed a natural and unpretentious charm. However, Colin was not in the mood to admire a beauty at this moment. He sized up Trisalai with an undisguised scrutinizing gaze, and did not respond to her congratulatory words. He asked stiffly, How did you know that Her Majesty would have a difficult birth? Faced with Colin's questioning, Trisalai smiled gently and said calmly, Because the reason for Her Majesty's difficult birth is actually related to me. Colin immediately narrowed his eyes. He did not expect this High Priestess to be so frank. Oh. How is it related? Earl, you should have seen the phantom of the phoenix that appeared in the sky above Silvermoon City last night, right? I saw it. What was that? That was the projection of the remnant soul of the phoenix in the world. Seeing Colin's confused expression, Trisalai continued to explain, Legend has it that before the age of the dragons, phoenixes were the rulers of this world. However, due to some unknown reasons, they have disappeared for tens of thousands of years. However, their bloodline has not been completely cut off, because the elves are said to have inherited the phoenix bloodline. The elves are extremely respectful of the phoenix bloodline. The more concentrated the phoenix bloodline, the higher their status. In order to maintain the purity of the phoenix bloodline, the elves with a high concentration of the phoenix bloodline are no longer willing to marry the elves with a low concentration of the phoenix bloodline. They even gradually evolved into a separate branch of the race, the High Elves. Among the High Elves, the ones with the highest concentration of the phoenix bloodline are the royals. Their most distinctive features are their fiery red pupils and hair. Hearing this, Colin's expression changed. This was because his newborn daughter had fiery red pupils. As for her hair, although it was sparse, it was also fiery red. It seemed that his daughter did indeed have a high concentration of the phoenix bloodline that only the High Elves royals would have. However, Aisha was a half-elf with a lowly bloodline, so it was obviously impossible for her to give birth to such a baby girl naturally. Someone must have done something. Colin suppressed his emotions and continued listening to Trisalai's story. With the passage of time, the bloodline of the High Elves will inevitably become thinner with each generation, to the point where you won't find a single red-eyed, red-haired descendant in the entire royal family. In order to purify the bloodline of their descendants, the High Elves created a ritual called blood blessing. This ritual required the consumption of a precious meteorite called the Phoenix Soul Stone Fragment, which had a certain probability of improving the bloodline of an unborn child. It could even allow ordinary elves to give birth to the red-eyed and red-haired phoenix bloodline that only the noblest High Elf royalty could possess. However, the Phoenix Soul Stone, that falls from the sky is too rare, and only one will fall every few hundred years. That's why the royal family of the High Elves inevitably declined even with this secret ritual to improve their bloodline. In the end, they couldn't even find a descendant who could become the Phoenix King. Colin wasn't interested in the decline of the High Elves, so he couldn't help but interrupt. So, the Phoenix Phantom that appeared in the sky above Silver Moon City last night was someone casting the blessing of blood, in an attempt to raise the bloodline of Her Majesty's fetus? Yes. Then who was the one who performed this ritual? It's me. Tricely admitted it openly, without any hesitation. Colin snorted and laughed coldly. Tricely, you don't think that I'll thank you for this, do you? Of course not. Tricely shook her head lightly and said indifferently, as a half-elf, Her Majesty is unable to give birth to a high elf royalty. This ritual seems to be raising the fetus's bloodline, but in reality, it will take the lives of the mother and daughter. So, I'm very curious, how did Her Majesty give birth so smoothly? Colin obviously wouldn't tell Tricely how he saved Aisha and her daughter. He stared coldly into her eyes and said angrily. So, you admit that you tried to murder Her Majesty? Yes. Why? Marquis Vincent of the Eastern region found me and promised that as long as I helped him perform this ritual and successfully caused an accident in Queen Aisha's labor, he would let the Temple of Destiny control the fate of the half-elf kingdom. Colin wasn't too surprised by this answer. Whether it was the reappearance of his old rival, Marquis Vincent, or the betrayal of the Temple of Destiny, it was all within reason. What he really couldn't understand was the actions of this high priest. If that's the case, why are you appearing in front of me again? Do you really think that I don't dare to kill you? Count, the reason why I'm here is to make up for my mistakes, haha. Colin interrupted with a cold smile. You're not going to tell me that you've just performed the ritual and put Elsa and her mother in extreme danger, and then you've suddenly found your conscience and come to the palace in person to save them? In the face of Colin's doubts, Tricely still answered calmly. Yes, Count. Maybe it's hard for you to believe, but in fact, when I found out that my ritual was successful, the first thing I thought of was to save Her Majesty and the child in her belly. Do you know why? Colin sneered. Why? Because I found that the blessing of blood ritual was more successful than I thought. Tricely looked at Colin with bright eyes. If I'm not wrong, Her Majesty's baby girl should have red eyes and red hair, right? Seeing Colin nodding, Tricely's pious expression became more and more intense. Yes, Count. I originally wanted to cooperate with the Eastern region to murder Her Majesty the Queen, but I thought that the fetus in Her Majesty's womb would at most have the blood of an ordinary high elf. I didn't expect it to be the most noble and rare high elf royal blood. This must be the blessing of the goddess of destiny. The high elf royal blood has reappeared in the world. How can such a miracle be compared with what the Eastern region promised? That's why I came to the palace without hesitation to help Her Majesty give birth. After listening to Tricely's explanation, Colin didn't speak anymore. Instead, he rubbed his chin as if he was considering whether her words were credible. Tricely saw this and spoke again. Count, I know it's hard for you to believe my words alone. So, I've prepared a gift for you. Oh. What gift? Marquis Vincent of the Eastern region is still in the Temple of Destiny. If you believe me, please send an elite team to follow me back. We'll definitely catch him. Only then did Colin reveal a satisfied smile and clap his hands. A figure shrouded in armor silently appeared in the living room. Tricely glanced at the armored man curiously before reminding Colin, My lord, Marquis Vincent's guards are extraordinary when he came to Silver Moon City this time. There's even a rank 5 knight among them. Colin interrupted indifferently, you just take my people to find Vincent. You don't have to worry about what happens next. Seeing the confident look on Colin's face, Tricely was relieved. She immediately bowed and then turned to leave. The armored man immediately followed her silently. Chapter 387. The curtains blocked out the sunlight, and the smell of amber and roses filled the bedroom with a tranquil atmosphere. Colin walked in quietly and found that Aisha and his daughter had already fallen asleep. He hurriedly held his breath and slowed down his heartbeat, afraid that he would wake up the two sleeping beauties in front of him. Kneeling by the bed, Colin stared motionlessly at the pink little fellow in Aisha's arms. She had long, pointed ears like Aisha's, and single eyelids like Colin's. However, her sparse hair was different from the two of them, it was a fiery red. Round little face, chubby little hands and feet, and dense curly eyelashes. In Colin's eyes, this delicate little fellow was simply the creator's greatest masterpiece. He looked at her without blinking, as if he was looking at a miracle, a treasure, a gift. "That's my daughter, ah." Colin sighed silently, and he couldn't help but reach out to gently touch the little fellow. The little fellow seemed to feel her father's touch. She hummed a few times, and her chubby little hands waved randomly before coincidentally grabbing onto Colin's fingers. Colin didn't dare to move, and he blamed himself for disturbing his daughter's sleep. Fortunately, the little fellow didn't wake up, and Colin secretly heaved a sigh of relief. However, this commotion woke up Queen Aisha. She opened her big blue eyes, and there was still fatigue in her gaze, but it was also brimming with unconcealable happiness. After seeing her lover, Aisha stretched her body lazily and revealed a warm smile. She asked in a low voice, "You're right." She asked softly, "Have you finished dealing with that high priestess of the goddess of fate?" Colin didn't answer immediately, but first looked at his daughter. Seeing that the little fellow was still sleeping soundly, he lowered his voice and said, "Yes." Then, he recounted the situation of his meeting with High Priestess Trisalai to Aisha. Aisha listened quietly, pondered for a moment, and asked, "Do you believe what Trisalai said?" Colin shook his head and said without hesitation, "I don't believe you." Aisha immediately smiled. "Then why did you send someone to follow her to capture Marquis Vincent?" "I just want to see what kind of tricks she can play." Colin shrugged and said casually, "Moreover, this is also a form of surveillance to prevent the high priest from escaping. Of course, if she really delivers Marquis Vincent to me, perhaps I can consider letting her live." Aisha nodded, agreeing with Colin's way of handling the matter. However, she was still a little puzzled as she asked, "Why do you think Chui Silly took the initiative to come to the palace?" Colin smiled coldly and said, "I'm guessing that Chui Silly originally thought that you wouldn't be able to successfully give birth to the child, so she felt that this was a good opportunity. Since she was able to enhance our daughter's bloodline through the ritual, she must have some kind of secret method to help you give birth. If she really helps you get through this, she will definitely gain our trust. This way, the Temple of Destiny will have an opportunity to be reborn." Aisha thought for a moment and said, "Then is it possible that Chui Silly originally planned to use the eastern region to swindle the Phoenix Soul Stone fragment from the house of Saint Prospero? On the surface, it was to harm me, but in reality, it was to use my belly to give birth to a high elf royal bloodline." Colin muttered, "It is possible, but, is the high elf royal bloodline really that important to the Temple of Destiny? I can't be sure." However, the most credible guess as to why the elves suddenly disappeared was that there was a huge turmoil within their clan. In order to prevent outsiders from taking advantage of the chaos, they chose to seal off the Radiant Moon Forest and cut off contact with the outside world. The root of the chaos was because they lacked an elven king that was recognized by all of their clansmen. This caused the entire clan to fall apart, and the internal strife continued. So, if a high elf royal bloodline suddenly appeared at this time, maybe Chui Silly thought that it could end the chaos. Colin nodded, thinking that Aisha's guess was very reasonable. This might also be the reason why Chui Silly did not hesitate to betray Marquis Vincent when she found out that Aisha had successfully given birth. From the beginning, the High Priest of the Temple of Destiny did not really intend to rely on the eastern region. However, Colin always liked to be lenient with his enemies, so that he could prevent the worst from happening. "Let's wait for Chui Silly to help me catch Marquis Vincent." "Okay." Aisha nodded and asked, "How is the rebellion of the Silver Moon Guard?" The bloody cavalry has basically controlled the situation. Most of the Silvermoon Guard have surrendered, and only a few people are still stubbornly resisting. However, they won't be able to jump around for long. Aisha was relieved and smiled. Then she stroked the sleeping baby's chest a few times and said, "Now, the most important thing is waiting for you, my love." Colin was stunned and did not react for a moment. "What?" Aisha giggled and said, "Let's give our daughter a name." Colin also smiled and muttered, "Miller will be her family's surname." As for her name, Aisha looked at Colin, who was thinking, gently raised her delicate hand, stroked his face, and said lazily, "You'd better think of a few more names. You must satisfy me." "Okay." Colin was a little distressed, but he was more eager to try. He stared at the sleeping baby, and the feeling of blood connection emerged again. All of a sudden, Colin had an epiphany. The baby in front of him was the first mark Colin left in this world. It was also the recognition of the world's origin to him, an outsider. A kind of wonderful blood surged in Colin's body. In an instant his eyes turned into a deep red color. In a trance, Colin found that he seemed to be floating, passing through layers of palaces and flying above Silvermoon City. The warm sunlight surrounded him, and the gentle breeze supported his body. Above the boundless void, a deep gaze was cast over, as if it was from countless planes and eras. For a moment, Colin seemed to be inspired by something, and he could not help but speak. "Her name is Sylph, the incarnation of fire, the Queen of Elves." At this moment, the whole Silvermoon City heard this voice. Sylph. In the luxurious villa in the center of the business district, a group of half-elves who were nervous looked up at the same time and saw the shock and confusion in each other's eyes. Sylph. In a certain alley in Silvermoon City, Duke Modwin, who was still resisting with all his might, was suddenly stunned. However, at this moment, he was shocked to find that the Silvermoon Guard who had fought with him until this moment had all put down their weapons. Sylph. In the Temple of Destiny, Marquis Vincent frowned and looked in the direction of the half-elven palace, his heart heavy. Sylph. The Queen of Elves. Outside the temple, High Priestess Trisolite suddenly knelt on the ground and kowtowed, chanting. Chapter 388. Outside the Temple of Fate, High Priestess Trisolite slowly got up. The voice was still lingering in her ears. Trisolite's face was filled with a kind of piety as if she was on a pilgrimage. She stared at the direction of the half-elven palace. Sylph. Trisolite gently said the name, and then as if she had gained some kind of firm belief, she strode toward the Temple of Fate. Along the way, the priests in the temple gathered around and asked at once, "Your Excellency, what was that just now? Was it the oracle of the goddess of fate? Did the blessing of blood you presided over succeed?" Trisolite put down her hands and made a gesture to calm them down. She said, "Everyone, now I have something more important to do. Please allow me to explain to you later." Only then did the priests realize that there was a silent armored man behind Trisolite. At the same time, there was a crisp sound of horse hooves outside the temple. Obviously, this place had been surrounded by the blood cavalry. They suddenly realized something, and their faces turned pale. They didn't dare to say more and let Trisolite lead the armored man into the temple. After passing through the prayer hall and a quiet corridor, Trisolite led the armored man to a wooden door. "Knock, knock." Trisolite gently knocked on the wooden door and asked, "Marquis Vincent, are you inside?" There was no response. Trisolite was about to knock again, but suddenly she found that her arm was grabbed by the armored man behind her, and then pulled back violently. "You." Before Trisolite could ask the question, the wooden door in front of her suddenly exploded. Boom! Countless fine wood chips flew around under the huge impact. Trisolite widened her eyes and looked in horror at a war hammer the size of a baby's head coming out from behind the door. Fortunately, the armored man blocked in time in front of Trisolite. The war hammer hit the armored man's chest hard, and suddenly a deep dent was made. But the armored man didn't seem to feel it at all. He didn't retreat but rushed into the wooden door with an indomitable momentum. Boom! The terrible power completely smashed the shaky wooden door, and large pieces of wood and dust filled the space. Tricoli was thrown out by the armored man. She staggered a few steps before she steadied herself against the railing. Raising her head, she saw Marquis Vincent sitting upright on a chair, swirling a glass of red wine in his hand. He looked at Tricoli coldly and said, "High Priestess, I didn't expect you to bring me such a surprise." After the ceremony, Tricoli told Marquis Vincent that she wanted to personally confirm the results of the ceremony. Only then did she leave the temple and go to Half-Elven Palace. However, when Marquis Vincent heard that godlike name, he immediately guessed that he might have been betrayed. Tricoli smiled faintly and replied, "Sir Marquis, Her Majesty the Queen has given birth to a daughter successfully. Shouldn't you go and congratulate her?" Marquis Vincent sneered, "Do you really think you've made a wise choice, Tricoli? But let me tell you, people like you who don't keep their promises and go back on their words won't be valued by anyone." Tricoli said expressionlessly, "For the glory of the goddess to be able to shine on this land, sacrificing my reputation is nothing." The corner of Marquis Vincent's mouth twitched, but he didn't say anything. He could see that this high priestess of the goddess of fate was a crazy believer. She couldn't be judged by common sense. Tricoli also didn't say anything, quietly watching the battle in front of her. Similar to the priests of the Church of Radiance, the priests of the Temple of Fate weren't a fighting profession. Tricoli saw the situation in front of her and didn't have any thoughts of going forward to help. She only hoped that the mysterious armored man sent by Earl Angelo could smoothly subdue Marquis Vincent's guard. Bang! 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 Under the powerful attacks of the armored man, Marquis Vincent's night guard had no choice but to retreat step by step. The aftermath of the battle spread out in the narrow space, causing the whole building to shake. Dust and gravel rustled down, as if the whole building would collapse in the next second. "Who are you?" Marquis Vincent couldn't help but ask. He knew that his guard was a 5th-grade knight. To be able to suppress him like this, it had to be a 6th-grade knight. But when did the half-elves have such an expert? As for the Angeli family, Marquis Vincent didn't think that they would have a fighter of this level. Even the House of St. Hilda might not be able to send such a 6th-grade expert to Silvermoon City. The armored man didn't pay attention to Marquis Vincent's question. The sword in his hand turned into a shadow, constantly stabbing at the vital points of the Eastern Knight's body. The Eastern Knight dodged left and right, barely dodging, but suddenly found a silver sword drawing a strange curve in front of his eyes, instantly chopping at his right hand. "Chi! Ah!" The Eastern Knight screamed. His entire right hand was cut off, and the warhammer in his hand fell to the ground. Marquis Vincent's expression changed. He got up without hesitation, threw the wine glass in his hand at the armored man, and then rushed to the window. Bang! Seeing Marquis Vincent break the window and escape, the armored man immediately chased after him. Boom! At this moment, the wooden cabinet by the window suddenly exploded, and a knight bathed in golden light rushed out. He was also wearing a heavy armor and holding a long spear. His whole body was like an angry black bear, charging at the armored man. The armored man was caught off guard and was stabbed in the waist by the long spear. The huge impact made the tip of the spear instantly penetrate the armor and come out from the other side. The Eastern Knight didn't have the slightest intention of holding back. Holding the spear with both hands, he continued to charge forward. Boom! The armored man was pushed back by the long spear until he slammed into the stone wall, creating a big hole. The situation took a turn for the worse, and Tricely, who was watching the battle from the sidelines, could not help but exclaim. But before she could react, she saw Marquis Vincent, who had fled, suddenly appear at the hole behind the armored man. "Go to hell." Marquis Vincent sneered and stabbed a sharp sword into the armored man's back. But just when the Eastern Marquis thought the situation was settled, the armored man suddenly stretched out his hands and quickly reached forward. The Eastern knight in front of him was careless and couldn't dodge. His steel-like fingers were inserted into his helmet. Snap! A drop of red blood dripped from the armored man's fingers and splashed on the ground. Ah ah ah! The Eastern knight covered his bloody and empty eye sockets with both hands, raised his head and screamed. Before Marquis Vincent could react, he saw the armored man in front of him suddenly turn sideways. His right hand stretched out like a viper and instantly grabbed his throat. Ah ah! Marquis Vincent looked at the seemingly unkillable armored man in horror, his mind blank. Although his whole face was hidden in the armor, Marquis Vincent seemed to see the corner of his mouth grinning. Marquis Vincent, you have been captured again. Chapter 389. Although he had become a captive, Marquis Vincent still tried his best to straighten his back when he walked into the half-elven palace. However, in the eyes of outsiders, this kind of effort was always a bit weak in reality. Moreover, this was the second time Marquis Vincent walked into the palace as a captive. The unspeakable shame was like a poisonous snake biting into Marquis Vincent's heart. He couldn't help but wonder if Colin Angeli was destined to be his nemesis. He thought that this trip to Silver Moon City could wash away his shame, but he didn't expect that. When Marquis Vincent finally saw Colin in the palace, he was playing with the baby girl in his arms. When Colin saw Marquis Vincent and the others, he was ready to hand his daughter to a maid and send her to Aisha. However, the little girl seemed to like Colin very much. As soon as she left Colin's arms, she immediately burst into tears. Colin tried several times, but it didn't work. Colin was helpless, but he was also a bit smug. He could only hold his baby daughter and say to Marquis Vincent, "Sorry, the little girl is too clingy." Trisilae looked at Colin with deep meaning and said with a smile, "Earl, Her Royal Highness likes the smell on your body." Marquis Vincent rolled his eyes and didn't say anything. From his point of view, Colin was purposely showing contempt for him. Colin paced in the palace and patted Sylph's back gently to calm her down. He then said to Marquis Vincent, "Marquis Vincent, we meet again." Colin was in a good mood, not only because he had caught a big fish like Marquis Vincent, but also because Marquis Vincent had sent 2 5th-grade knights over as well. These 2 5th-grade knights were already locked up by the Blood Cavalry, waiting for Colin to turn them into blood slaves. In this way, the strength of the Blood Shadow Guards under Colin's command increased greatly. Including the 2 5th-grade knights who were about to join, there were now 2 6th-grade knights, 4 5th-grade knights, and more than 300 professionals of other grades. A high-end combat force of this scale would not be inferior to any of the paladin clans with deep foundations. Of course, if this paladin family really had a living paladin, that would be a different story. What's more, Marquis Vincent was an important prisoner, so Colin could use him to exchange for a lot of good things from the eastern region. The corner of Marquis Vincent's mouth twitched, and he said disdainfully, "You're just lucky." Colin was amused. He pointed at Chui Silly and said, "Is this the blessing of the goddess of fate?" Trisley immediately said respectfully, "Yes, my lord. You, Her Majesty the Queen, and Princess Sylph are all people who are greatly favored by the goddess, and also the hope for the prosperity of the half-elven kingdom." Marquis Vincent sneered and said, "Colin, I advise you to be careful of this woman. She's a viper who doesn't keep her promises and bites the hand that feeds her. She has no sense of honor or bottom line. I really don't know how the goddess of destiny can have a believer like you." In the face of Marquis Vincent's slander, Chui Silly still looked indifferent, as if these accusations could not hurt her at all. Colin looked at Chui Silly with great interest, waiting for her to refute and explain, but unexpectedly, the High Priestess had no intention of speaking at all. For a moment, Colin could not figure out the High Priestess' intentions. However, he did not care too much. Since Chui Silly had helped Colin capture Marquis Vincent, then Colin would not pursue her previous mistakes. Of course, Colin would not trust this woman because of this, let alone agree to any of her conditions. It was like a piece of toilet paper, once used, it could be thrown away. Chui Silly did not know whether she did not realize that she was of no value in Colin's eyes and had accepted her fate, or whether she was confident in her ability to gain Colin's trust. In short, she still remained silent. However, Marquis Vincent was not willing to give up, and asked, I promised this woman before, the leadership of the whole half-elf kingdom, but she still betrayed me. So, Colin Angeli, what did you promise her? Colin shrugged and said, I did not promise anything. Marquis Vincent's face was full of disdain, as if he thought that Colin was lying. Unexpectedly, Chui Silly opened her mouth and said, yes. This is my gift to Count Angeli, and I do not ask for anything in return. That's impossible. Marquis Vincent obviously could not accept this result. Chui Silly did not say anything, but she looked at Sylph in Colin's arms with bright eyes, as if that was the real reason why she changed her position, and all that she wanted in return. Although Colin did not know what the High Priestess was planning, he did not ask any more, and instead asked Marquis Vincent. Vincent, you are now my captive, so this time, what is the East going to give me to redeem you? Marquis Vincent snorted and said, what do you want? Colin rubbed his chin, thought for a moment, and said, I want 15 heavy warships, 180 light paddle sail warships, and 200 medium transport ships. Marquis Vincent heard this, and immediately laughed and said sarcastically, Count Angeli, you want the House of Saint Prospero to pack up the Pegasus Navy for you? Colin shrugged and said with a smile, I think you are the first successor of the Duke of the East, and if the price is too low, it will be an insult to you. Oh, my father has 3 children who can inherit the title, but the House of Saint Prospero only has 1 navy. Marquis Vincent spoke in a cold tone, Count Angeli, what do you think my father will do? Colin thought for a moment, and seemed to think that Marquis Vincent's words were reasonable, so he suggested, how about this, you write a letter back and ask the Duke of Saint Prospero how many warships he is willing to give you. But I have to remind you, if you don't have enough warships, I won't let you go easily. Okay. Marquis Vincent nodded stiffly. Colin saw this, and suddenly said again, oh, by the way, Marquis Vincent, I remember that your brother, the Earl of Avon, is now at the northern frontier. Tell me, if he learns that you've been captured, will he try to stop you from being ransomed? Marquis Vincent's mouth twitched a few times, and apparently he realized the crisis he was in. He immediately nodded and said, I will write to my father as soon as possible, and ask him to give you a satisfactory price. That's right. Colin smiled and nodded. At this time, he also found that Sylph in his arms had fallen asleep, so he generously lowered his head and kissed the little girl's forehead. Okay, it's time for a nap, time to rest. After saying this, Colin turned around and walked into the hall with Sylph in his arms, no longer paying attention to Marquis Vincent and Trisley. Marquis Vincent looked at Chui Silly beside him and suddenly revealed a sinister smile, saying, Chui Silly, I'll remember this debt. The House of Saint Prospero won't let any traitor go easily. Trisley heard this, turned around calmly, and stared into Marquis Vincent's eyes without fear, and said calmly, you don't represent the House of Saint Prospero. This sentence seemed to have hit Marquis Vincent's soft spot, and his face instantly became extremely terrifying. But fortunately, he knew his current situation, and didn't lose his temper. He only hid the hatred deep in his heart, and growled, Trisley, let's wait and see. Chapter 390. Duke Modwin, are you willing to surrender? Knight Roger urged his horse forward and asked expressionlessly. Yes, we are willing to surrender. Before Duke Modwin could say anything, his son, Charlie, scrambled to Knight Roger and begged. At this time, the Silvermoon Guards were already at the end of their rope. Other than surrendering, they had no other choice. Knight Roger glanced at Charlie but ignored him. He continued to look at Duke Modwin. Obviously, he felt that a child like Charlie could not make the decision. Duke Modwin was stunned. His eyes were dull and empty, as if he did not hear Knight Roger's question. Seeing this, Kamei's Modwin could only stand up and said in a trembling voice, "I'm sorry, Sir Knight. Duke Modwin is grieving over the death of a large number of his soldiers. That's why." Ha! Ha! Before he could finish, he was stuck. Because a sharp sword had pierced through Kamei's throat. Behind Camus, his nephew, Duke Modwin, who was immersed in grief, slowly pulled out his sword and let Camus' corpse fall to the ground. Then, Duke Modwin walked to Charlie, who was standing there in a daze without any expression on his face. Before Charlie could react to what had happened, Duke Modwin slit his own son's throat with his sword. F.A. Father, Knight Roger looked at the tragic scene in front of him with interest and did not stop it. However, when he saw Duke Modwin raising his sword towards his throat again, Knight Roger urged his horse forward and knocked the sword out of Duke Modwin's hand. "Duke Modwin, you can't die yet. The Count wants to see you." From what he said, he did not stop Duke Modwin from killing his uncle and son because Colin did not plan to see them. Duke Modwin looked like he had nothing left to live for. He did not speak, but he did not resist either. He probably thought of himself as a dead man and let them do whatever they wanted. Seeing this, Knight Roger waved his hand and gestured for the soldiers to subdue Duke Modwin. He then walked towards the half-elven palace. In the palace, Colin was changing into his formal attire with the help of the maids. The little fellow had sprayed some good stuff on his clothes just now, so he could only change them and wash them. Knight Roger led Duke Modwin into the hall and reported, "My lord, the rebellion of the Silvermoon Guard has been completely quelled. The mastermind, Duke Modwin, has been escorted to you." "Well done." Colin praised and waved his hand to signal the maid to leave. Then, he buttoned the last few buttons himself and walked up to Roger, asking, "How are the casualties?" "It is roughly estimated that the casualties of the bloody cavalry are about 400. I need further verification for more detailed statistics." Colin nodded with satisfaction. The casualties were not large. It seemed that the bloody cavalry had a terrible fighting capacity even if they could not play the advantage of cavalry in the street battle, which made Colin very pleased. "All right, you can leave first. Maintain order in the city and find all the half-elves who participated in the rebellion." "Yes, sir." After Knight Roger saluted and left, Colin turned to Duke Modwin. At this time, Duke Modwin's eyes were dull, and his whole body was exuding a lifeless aura. If it was not because of the blood connection between them, Colin would have thought that he was his blood slave. "William, Her Majesty the Queen is very disappointed in you." Duke Modwin did not respond. Colin waited for a moment. Seeing that he had no intention to speak, he continued. "When Her Majesty the Queen was about to give birth, she deliberately handed over the military and political power of Silvermoon City to you. To be honest, even I can't understand this trust." Hearing this, Duke Modwin's eyeballs finally moved, but he still did not speak. Colin did not care about the rudeness of the other party and continued. "I once advised her to give away part of the power to prevent some people with bad intentions from taking the opportunity to rebel. But Her Majesty the Queen firmly told me, my throne was given to me by William. If he wanted to take it back, he would not have given it away." Colin came to Duke Modwin's side and patted him on the shoulder. He said in a deep voice, "Her Majesty really treats you like her own son." Duke Modwin's face finally showed some expression. He opened his mouth and stammered a few times before hissing, "I have let Her Majesty down." Colin looked at Duke Modwin with bright eyes and asked seriously, "William, when you gave away the right to inherit the throne, were you already unwilling?" Duke Modwin shook his head and said, "No, Count. Actually, I know that I am not talented. Even if I take the throne, I do not have the ability to lead the half-elven kingdom to prosperity. Therefore, when you asked me if I was willing to give the throne to my mother, I actually heaved a sigh of relief." "I believe you," Colin said sincerely, and I also know that the reason you were involved in the rebellion was all because of your son, Charlie. Duke Modwin's eyes instantly turned red. Not sure if it was because he thought of his son, Charlie, that he had just killed with his own hands, or because he was touched by Colin's understanding and trust. Colin saw all of this and was slightly pleased. He said, "So, I have decided to give you another chance." "No." Duke Modwin shook his head and said, "I have let down Her Majesty's trust, and I am not worthy of your forgiveness. Now, I only ask for death. Only then can I redeem my sins." "You want to die?" "Yes." Duke Modwin raised his head and stared into Colin's eyes. The determination in his eyes seemed unshakable. Colin pursed his lips and said, "Death is a release, but it is also an escape. If you really want to repay Her Majesty's trust and redeem your sins, you have to survive first." Duke Modwin still shook his head. "I'm sorry, Count. There is nothing left in this world for me to miss, is that so?" Colin interrupted coldly, "You don't care about the House of Medea anymore." Duke Modwin was suddenly stunned. He stammered for a while before he said in a low voice, "Since the House of Medea has made a mistake, they will naturally be at Her Majesty's disposal. I just hope that Her Majesty will spare the innocent people in the tribe for the sake of the past." "Innocent?" Colin smiled coldly, "You are all treason. How are you innocent? Even if Her Majesty wants to exterminate your tribe, no one will dare to say anything." Duke Modwin's face instantly turned pale. He trembled as he begged, "Count, please advise Her Majesty not to do so. Otherwise, she will leave a tyrannical reputation and destroy her benevolent image in the hearts of the half-elves." Colin snorted and said, "William, I just said that I can give you a chance to redeem yourself. Do you still want to die?" Duke Modwin hurriedly said, "Count, I am willing to accept this chance. No matter what Her Majesty or you ask of me, I will do my best to do it for you." Colin took a step forward and asked, "Even if you have to pay with your life?" Duke Modwin was stunned for a moment before he nodded firmly and said, "Count, I have always wanted to die. As long as Her Majesty is willing to give the House of Medea a way out, I am willing to die even if I have to die." Colin nodded with satisfaction and said, "Good. As long as you help me do one thing, the House of Medea will not be held accountable. Please tell me." Chapter 391. The afternoon sun shone through the window and into a side hall of the half-elven palace. The colorful spots of light formed a complicated and disorderly pattern on the white glazed rock floor. These patterns attracted Javier's attention. He stared at the ground seriously, as if he was trying to figure out some profound truth from these light shadows. Of course, although Javier was a legendary half-elf merchant in Silvermoon City, he didn't know much about the principles of geometry. The only reason he was staring at these patterns was because he was too bored. After the rebellion of the Silvermoon Guards was quelled, the half-elven merchants who had set fire to the granary were naturally invited to the palace one by one. They had been sitting here for half a day, but Queen Aisha and Count Angeli still did not ask for them. This caused the half-elf merchants to be in a state of anxiety and fear. However, as time passed, their emotions gradually became numb. They began to calm down and think hard about what they should do next to obtain the Queen's forgiveness. Cough. "Excuse me, can we have some water?" A half-elf merchant could not help but ask the guards in the hall with a hoarse voice. However, it was as if the armored guards did not hear him at all. They did not even respond to his request. Havel was about to open his mouth, but he saw a handsome young man walking into the hall. "Count Angeli." The half-elf stood up and bowed to him. Colin walked to the main seat and sat down. He waved his hand and asked the others to sit down as well. The young half-elf maids walked into the hall quietly and served wine to everyone. The overflowing aroma of the wine made the half-elf merchants who had been thirsty for half a day swallow their saliva. However, they didn't dare to touch the red wine before Colin raised his glass. Colin glanced at the half-elves. Perhaps they were feeling guilty, but none of the half-elves dared to look him in the eyes. "Gentlemen, I invited you here because I want to ask you a question on behalf of the Queen." Colin opened his mouth. It was hard to tell whether he was happy or angry. "Why did you set the granary on fire?" It was a difficult question to answer. The hall fell into an awkward silence. The half-elf merchants wanted nothing more than to bury their heads in their chests. They didn't even dare to breathe loudly for fear of attracting Colin's attention and being called out by him. Colin didn't seem to be in a hurry. He lifted the goblet in front of him and spun it gently in his hand. The dark red wine collided back and forth in the goblet, forming a small vortex. The fragrance of the wine spread out and constantly stimulated the sensitive nerves of the half-elf merchants. Javier glanced at Colin from the corner of his eye. The young Count of the Empire was observing the swirls in the wine cup with great interest. There was a faint smile on his handsome face, as if he were an ordinary young man who was gentle and curious. However, he didn't dare to treat Colin as a harmless young noble. This Count of the Empire was an old acquaintance of the half-elf merchant, and he knew Colin's rise like the back of his hand. That was a path of advancement paved with corpses and blood. "Javier." Colin didn't know if he had noticed Javier's gaze, but he directly called out the half-elf legendary merchant's name. "Sir Count." Javier stood up abruptly, as if he was a naughty student who was called out by the teacher in class. The rest of the half-elf merchants saw this and heaved a sigh of relief. Only Javier stood there stiffly. Cold sweat poured out like spring water, instantly drenching the front of his robe. Colin smiled faintly and asked, "Mr. Javier, please answer Her Majesty's question." If he could turn back time, Javier swore to God that he wouldn't have peeked. But now, he could only bite the bullet and answer, "Sir Count, it's because Marquis Vincent from the eastern region forced us to do this." Colin's expression didn't change. He was still gentle and refined, but in Javier's eyes, that face was no different from the devil's. Before Colin could continue asking, Javier hurriedly added, "But Sir Count, don't worry. We were already prepared. Before burning the granary, we secretly replaced most of the food with hay. So, even if the granary is burned, most of the food is still there. As long as you don't hold us accountable, I'm willing to sell the food to you at the lowest price." After Javier finished speaking, the rest of the half-elf merchants started to clamor. "Yes, Sir Count, I also hid the food in advance." "Me too, Sir Count, and I'm also willing to sell it to you at a low price." "My Lord Count, me too." Colin heard this and instantly laughed. He didn't know if he was happy that there was still food in stock, or if he was laughing at how crafty these half-elf merchants were. Of course, this wasn't surprising. If these half-elf merchants really burned the food that they had painstakingly stored, it would be worse than killing them. "Very good." Colin nodded in satisfaction, and the hall instantly quietened down. When the half-elf merchants saw the smile on Colin's face, the huge rock in their hearts finally fell. But just as they were rejoicing that they had escaped a calamity, Colin suddenly retracted his smile and coldly said, "However, your actions are in fact treason." "Sir Count, we were also forced." The merchants were still crying. "Forced?" Colin sneered. "Then why didn't you report it? Instead, you chose to follow the orders of the rebel army?" The half-elf merchants were instantly speechless. Javier hurriedly took the initiative to say, "Sir Count, we were indeed muddle-headed and made a foolish choice. If you're willing to forgive our mistakes, I'm willing to give you all the food for free." As soon as this was said, the other half-elf merchants felt their hearts bleeding, but they had no choice but to quickly agree and express their willingness to give up their food for free. Colin's expression softened a little, and he said calmly, "That's not enough." Javier endured the pain in his heart and respectfully asked, "Sir Count, if you have any other orders, please feel free to speak. Do you know the Northern Frontier Foreign Trade Company?" "Yes." Javier nodded. He already understood that Colin was preparing to forcefully integrate the half-elf business. Indeed, in the next moment, he heard Colin say, "Her Majesty and I have discussed for a long time, and we have decided to establish a half-elf foreign trade company." Hearing this, the half-elf merchants immediately felt anxious. They knew that what was coming would come in the end. But before they could say anything, they saw an attendant rush into the hall and report, "Sir Count, Marquis Vincent has been assassinated." What? Colin stood up with a whoosh. He no longer cared about these half-elf merchants and immediately walked out with large strides. Only when his figure disappeared outside the hall did the half-elf merchants react. At the same time, they were inexplicably shocked. Something big had happened. If the first successor to the House of St. Prospero died in Silverymoon City, the half-elf merchants looked at each other, using their eyes to communicate their thoughts. However, no one dared to break the oppressive silence. For a moment, they didn't know whether to rejoice in the misfortune of others or worry about the storm that was about to engulf Silverymoon City. Chapter 392. Although he had become a captive, Marquis Vincent's treatment was definitely different from other captives. He wouldn't be locked up in a prison or a captive camp. Instead, he would live in the side hall of the half-elven palace. The side hall was heavily guarded, not only to prevent outsiders from entering, but also to prevent those inside from escaping. Of course, he wouldn't be lacking in food and drink, and there were also young and beautiful half-elven maids serving him. If he deliberately forgot that he was a captive, Marquis Vincent would even feel like he was on vacation. Perhaps it was because this wasn't the first time he had been captured, but Marquis Vincent's ability to adjust his mental state had greatly improved. This time, he wasn't as pained and resentful as before. He even maintained a calm mind and planned a plan to redeem himself. He first wrote a letter to his father, the Duke of St. Prospero, blaming his failure all on High Priestess Trisseli's betrayal. He made it clear that if it weren't for this crazy woman's incomprehensible betrayal, he would have successfully caused Queen Aisha's death in childbirth, plunged Silvermoon City into endless chaos, and even forced Colin Angelo to leave the half-elven kingdom. Of course, he also wrote down the price Colin proposed for his redemption. However, he also understood that the Duke of St. Prospero wouldn't really give up a fleet in exchange for him. Therefore, he also suggested that his father send an eloquent messenger to Silvermoon City to discuss a ransom condition that both sides could accept. After writing this letter, Marquis Vincent thought for a while and wrote another letter to Earl Hall. Earl Hall was an old earl in the eastern region. His family was quite powerful, and his daughter was married to Marquis Vincent. Therefore, Marquis Vincent wanted to ask for his help. After all, this time, the eastern region didn't have Marquis Garcia as a bargaining chip. If they wanted to redeem Marquis Vincent, they would have to pay a huge price. Just as Colin had reminded him, Marquis Vincent was indeed worried that his father wouldn't be willing to pay a huge price to redeem him, or that his good younger brother would make things difficult for him. However, Marquis Vincent wasn't too worried. After all, he was still the Marquis of the Eastern region in name, and the first successor to the throne of the Eastern region. For the sake of the House of St. Prospero's reputation, his father wouldn't allow Marquis Vincent to be imprisoned in Silvermoon City. Marquis Vincent also knew that his father already had the idea of replacing his successor. The engagement between his younger brother, the Earl of Avon, and the daughter of the Paladin of the San Lorenzo family, Prince Lexi, was a manifestation of this idea. Unfortunately, things didn't go according to Marquis Vincent's wishes. Prince Lacy actually killed his own uncle, Consolidum. This made Prince Lacy turn from a respected paladin of the empire to an evil traitor who was despised by everyone overnight. This also caused the Earl of Avon's threat to Marquis Vincent to be greatly reduced. However, Marquis Vincent wouldn't let down his guard against his good younger brother, especially under such circumstances. His failure in Silvermoon City gave the Earl of Avon an excellent opportunity to turn things around. If the Earl of Avon used this opportunity to prevent him from returning to the Eastern region, or if he persuaded the Duke of St. Prospero to remove Vincent's identity as the successor to lower the price he had to pay, then it would be no different from the end of the world for Vincent. After writing the letter to Earl Hall, Marquis Vincent carefully considered it again before stuffing it into an envelope and sealing it with wax. Then, he got up and walked out of the study, preparing to hand the 2 letters to his attendants to send to the eastern region. At this moment, Marquis Vincent suddenly noticed an old acquaintance walking into the courtyard under the escort of his guards. Duke Modwin. Marquis Vincent smiled and greeted the other party. He guessed that the other party must have been captured and came here, and felt a sense of sympathy for him. Marquis Vincent. Duke Modwin bowed respectfully to Marquis Vincent and lowered his head, as if he wasn't too happy to see Marquis Vincent. Marquis Vincent knew the reason why Duke Modwin was a little cold. After all, Duke Modwin didn't intend to participate in this rebellion. It was only because his son Charlie was bewitched by someone that he had no choice but to join the rebellion. Now that he had fallen to such a state, Duke Modwin naturally wouldn't be nice to see the mastermind of this rebellion. After handing the 2 letters to his guards, Marquis Vincent pretended to be friendly and patted Duke Modwin's shoulder, smiling, "I didn't expect the 2 of us to become neighbors." Duke Modwin forced a smile and nodded, but didn't reply. "Why? Are you blaming me for dragging you into this?" "I wouldn't dare." Marquis Vincent could tell that Duke Modwin was insincere, but he didn't care. He smiled and invited him, come sit in my house. Things aren't as bad as you think." Duke Modwin didn't resist this time, and followed Marquis Vincent into the house. Marquis Vincent personally poured a cup of coffee for Duke Modwin. This polite gesture seemed to have finally moved Duke Modwin, and he asked sincerely, "Marquis Vincent, you just said that things aren't as bad as you think. Do you have any way to get the House of Medea out of its current misfortune?" Marquis Vincent smiled faintly, and said in an extremely confident tone, "William, don't worry. Queen Aisha wouldn't dare to kill you. Her throne was given to her by you. If she killed you, wouldn't she be known as an ungrateful person? The punishment for you this time is probably just a demotion in rank." "Demotion in rank? Only?" When Duke Modwin heard this, for some reason, he thought of his son and uncle that he had killed with his own hands. While his heart was bleeding, he didn't show it on his face. He just picked up the coffee, took a sip, and asked, "Then do we still have a chance for revenge?" "Of course." Marquis Vincent laughed heartily, and seemed to be very satisfied with Duke Modwin's drive. This time, Aisha and Colin have forcefully suppressed the rebellion in the country, but they haven't resolved the most fundamental conflict. Aisha still can't represent the interests of the half-elves. She's just a puppet supported by the northern frontier. As long as this doesn't change, Silverymoon City will be a fertile land for rebellion. We just need a little guidance, and there will be another rebellion. Seeing Duke Modwin's eyes flashing, Marquis Vincent thought that he had understood his thoughts. He came in front of him, put his hand on his shoulder, and confided in him. "William, in the eyes of the eastern region, only the House of Medea is the legitimate half-elven royal family. That Aisha Miller is just a puppet pushed up by the northern frontier. Believe me, when we make a comeback in the future, we'll definitely help you to the half-elven throne. Thank you for your trust." Duke Modwin was so emotional that his face was flushed red. He quickly got up and bowed to Marquis Vincent. Marquis Vincent laughed as he looked at Duke Modwin, who bowed to him. He was pleased with himself. Just as he was about to say a few more words of encouragement, he suddenly felt a pain in his waist. "You," Duke Modwin raised his head, and his face had already changed into a ferocious smile. "Do you Eastern Region people think that you're the savior of the half-elves? Unfortunately, in my eyes, you're just a demon who completely destroyed our peaceful lives for your own selfish interests. Bastard!" Marquis Vincent kicked Duke Modwin away, and then covered the wound on his waist. He rushed out of the room and roared, "Someone come quickly. William Modwin has gone mad." However, before the guards outside the hall could arrive, Marquis Vincent felt that a strong aura had locked onto him. It seemed that if he made any strange movements, a thunderous attack would be launched. Save! Before Marquis Vincent's cry for help, Duke Modwin rushed from behind and stabbed the dagger into his chest once again. Seeing Marquis Vincent slowly fall to the ground, Duke Modwin raised the bloody dagger and laughed to the sky. He did not hide the joy of getting his revenge. "This is your retribution." The guards outside the hall quickly rushed over, but before they could, Duke Modwin slit his own throat without any hesitation. The guards looked at the tragic scene in front of them and were stunned for a moment. Until someone woke up from his dream and roared, "Quick! Quickly inform the Earl." Chapter 393. Why was Duke Modwin able to bring a dagger in? Colin asked with a gloomy face as he looked at the bloody assassination scene in front of him. The guards looked at each other and finally fixed their eyes on a warrior who was fully covered in armor. They knew that it was Count Angeli's personal guard who personally searched Duke Modwin's body, but they did not know if it was because of his carelessness or. Colin also noticed the gazes of the guards and raised his head to look at his personal guard. The personal guard's face was hidden behind the thick armor and no one could see his expression clearly. However, when he saw Colin looking at him, he immediately knelt down on one knee and raised his sword high above his head. Although he did not say anything, his attitude meant that he was guilty. Colin looked coldly at the personal guard. He hesitated for a moment, but perhaps he thought of the serious consequences of this matter. In the end, he steeled his heart and took the personal guard's sword, plunging it straight into his chest. The personal guard screamed in pain and his head tilted to the side. He was no longer breathing. Colin waved his hand dispiritedly and said, "All of you are dismissed. No one is allowed to speak of what happened here." Yes. When only Colin was left in the courtyard, the anger on his face disappeared. The personal guard who was killed stood up again and ignored the sword that pierced through his chest. He took off his helmet and revealed a weather-beaten middle-aged face. He still did not say anything and just stood by the side quietly. Colin bent down and touched Marquis Vincent's pulse. He found that there was still a trace of life in this person, but it was quickly fading away. Therefore, he did not hesitate and immediately lowered his head to bite Marquis Vincent's neck. Gulp. Gulp, wisps of blood-red smoke rose and formed a mysterious and profound pattern between Colin and Marquis Vincent. As the blood-red light flashed, an ancient and strange ritual was in progress. After a long time, Colin raised his head and let out a long breath. He then had the time to check on Duke Modwin and found that this person was completely dead. This former half-elf prince was truly an honest person. Even in death, he had died so thoroughly. Perhaps, William Modwin had already decided to die. Colin lowered his head and observed a moment of silence for this person. Then, he saw Marquis Vincent's finger move slightly. Seeing this, he hurriedly turned his head and gave a look. The personal guard who had been standing at the side with a sword in his chest immediately fell to the ground and pretended to be a corpse. What's wrong with me?" Marquis Vincent got up in a daze, as if he had not figured out what was going on. "You're already dead," Colin said indifferently. Marquis Vincent was stunned. He looked at Colin and then at the corpse of Duke Modwin beside him. He finally came to his senses and said anxiously, "Count Angeli. This William Modwin wants to kill me." After a few quick breaths, Marquis Vincent discovered the two frightening wounds on his chest and waist. He was just about to ask Colin to find a doctor to treat him when he realized that these two wounds didn't seem to be too serious. There was no bleeding, no pain, as if the two wounds were just an illusion. What's wrong with me?" Colin smiled and reminded him again, "Didn't I tell you that you're already dead?" Marquis Vincent's face stiffened, and he said embarrassedly, "Count Angeli, please don't joke about this." "I'm not joking," Colin said seriously, "you're already dead. I gave you a second life." Marquis Vincent opened his mouth, but did not say anything. If it was in the past, if someone dared to say such words to him, Marquis Vincent would have slapped them to wake them up. But now, in the face of Colin's arrogant words, Marquis Vincent fell into deep thought. This was because he realized that the Colin in front of him was emitting an inexplicable aura. It was an irresistible power and holiness, and he could not help but have the urge to worship him from the bottom of his heart. Although the bone-deep hatred for Colin was still there, it was firmly suppressed by an even stronger sense of reverence in the depths of his heart. Moreover, Marquis Vincent had an inexplicable premonition that his life was in the hands of Colin. He could easily let him live, and he could also easily let him die. The enemy of his life was now the master of his own fate. You! What did you do to me? Marquis Vincent was suddenly plunged into endless fear. I gave you a second life, Colin said in a grand enchanted tone. All of a sudden, Marquis Vincent seemed to have realized something. Following that, his expression changed completely. It was as if he had been inspired by the God of Light. The fear and suspicion on his face gradually disappeared, and in its place was boundless reverence and devotion. You are the apostle of my Lord, the chosen one. That's right. Colin's face was full of sincerity, and he started to bluff. I came to the world under the orders of my Lord to investigate the matter of the transmission channel of faith being cut off. At the same time, I was ordered to clean up the corrupted upper echelons of the church. Now that Colin knew many secrets of the Church of Light, he naturally began to upgrade his brainwashing declaration. Normally, Marquis Vincent would definitely not believe such nonsense, but after experiencing the miracle of life and death and discovering that Count Angeli was emitting an irresistible holy light, Marquis Vincent had no choice but to believe it. Thus, the Marquis of the Eastern region immediately crawled on the ground, kissing Colin's toes, and said in an incomparably sincere tone, "The Almighty God of Light. You did not abandon the most pious and humble believer after all. May your glory reappear, illuminate all things in the world, and sweep away all evil." Colin blinked his eyes. He was clearly surprised that the effect of this speech was so good. Just as he was in a daze, Marquis Vincent raised his head and said in a clear voice, "Lord God's chosen one, what is my Lord's plan? Please tell me, I will do my best to help you complete it." Colin touched the tip of his nose and said indifferently, "I can't tell you my Lord's plan yet. If you are still loyal to your faith, then listen to my arrangements." "Yes, Lord God's chosen one." Marquis Vincent agreed without hesitation. This made Colin even suspect that this guy found out that his life was in his hands, and was worried that Colin would settle old scores with him, so he deliberately put on such a respectful appearance. However, Colin did not continue to probe. After all, he could easily kill Marquis Vincent through bloodline suppression, but he still could not test whether the other party's loyalty was reliable. Unless he turned Marquis Vincent into a blood slave without self-awareness. But that would be too wasteful. As for Marquis Vincent, Colin had great use for him. Thus, Colin changed the topic and asked, "What was the assassination attempt from before?" Marquis Vincent pointed to the corpse of Duke Modwin beside him and replied, "It was William Modwin, this guy, who suddenly took out a dagger and wanted to kill me like a madman." "Oh, right, it wasn't just him, I also felt another aura, at least rank 5. At this point, Marquis Vincent suddenly noticed that there was another corpse on the ground. He was the personal guard that Colin had killed with his own hands. But when Marquis Vincent saw the face of the personal guard, he was suddenly stunned. Chapter 394. Vincent, you know him, don't you? Yes. He is a knight of the House of St. Prospero. When I led the Pegasus Legion to Silvermoon City last year, he also went with the army. Marquis Vincent's face was a little dignified. So, after that battle, he swore allegiance to you? Colin nodded and said, yes. Although I announced to the public that all the prisoners of war of the Pegasus Legion had been killed, it was only to appease the Blood Cavalry and the half-elves. In fact, there were many high-grade professionals in the Pegasus Legion who were willing to surrender, but I secretly kept them. Marquis Vincent was not surprised by this. After all, it would be a waste to kill such a high-grade professional like an ordinary captive. If he were Colin, he would do the same. Although these Eastern knights who had changed their allegiance would be too ashamed to return to their hometown, it was better than dying. This time, I ordered this person to be your guard mainly because he was from the Eastern region. I thought he would be more attentive to you, but I didn't expect him to plot to assassinate you. Could it be that he blamed the defeat of the Pegasus Legion and his own capture on you? No, if that was the case, it wouldn't be enough for this person to take the risk to assassinate me. Marquis Vincent's eyes flashed, as if he had understood the real reason for the matter. Colin frowned and asked, "Oh. Listening to what you said, could there be other reasons?" Marquis Vincent nodded with a dignified face and said, "Lord Chosen One, this person is called John Fine. Although he is a knight of the House of Saint Prospero, he is actually from the Fine family. However, because he was born in a branch of the Fine family, he could not inherit the title. After showing his knightly talent, he chose to be loyal to the House of Saint Prospero and has been following me since. But this person is a member of the Fine family after all, and the Fine family. They have been jumping around in the Eastern region recently." "Fine." Colin touched his chin and pretended to think for a while before asking, "If I remember correctly, the Viscounts who recently appeared in Alfalfa City seems to be from the Fine family." "That's right. That Viscount Finn is his cousin, and the operation against Alfalfa City has always been the responsibility of my good younger brother, the Earl of Avon." Colin seemed to have suddenly realized something and said, "Could it be that the Fine family is a supporter of your younger brother, the Earl of Avon?" "Yes. In fact, the Fine's family was originally a dutiful family. Although they weren't close to me, they didn't deliberately get close to Evan. But recently, they've probably seen Evan getting engaged to Prince Lacey's daughter. That's why they're starting to support Evan as the successor of the Duke of the Eastern region." Marquis Vincent said through gritted teeth. I didn't expect that they would actually dare to make a move on me. No, the Fines shouldn't have the guts. It must be my good brother, the Earl of Avon, who secretly instigated it." Looking at Marquis Vincent, who had imagined the truth, Colin was laughing inside, but on the surface, he immediately put on a vexed expression. "It seems that I didn't understand the situation and appointed the wrong person, Sir God's Chosen One, you don't have to blame yourself." Marquis Vincent hurriedly persuaded, "In fact, if it weren't for your arrangement and exposing this person, I wouldn't have known that Evan could be so ruthless to take such measures against me for the sake of the inheritance. It's funny that I used to think that Evan was soft-hearted. Although he also wanted to inherit the position of the Duke of the Eastern region, he might not really dare to use the most extreme means. Now it seems that my good younger brother is really a person who can do great things." Colin looked at the ferocious Marquis Vincent and said with a smile, "Don't worry, since you've become my apostle, no one can take away the position of the Duke of the Eastern region from you." Marquis Vincent's spirit was lifted, and he hurriedly expressed his loyalty. "Thank you for your support, Sir God's Chosen One. Please rest assured, no matter what plan my lord has for sending you to the world, I will do my best to assist you in accomplishing it." Colin nodded with satisfaction and said, "Well then, you first make a list of the half-elves who participated in this rebellion." "Yes." Marquis Vincent answered without any hesitation. Then, he went to the desk, picked up a quill, and started writing. A moment later, Colin took the list of rebels from Marquis Vincent and looked at it carefully. In fact, Knight Roger had also given Colin a list of half-elves who participated in the rebellion, but Marquis Vincent's list was obviously more rich. This was understandable, after all, although many half-elven nobles originally agreed to participate in the rebellion, when it really came down to it, they might regret it, or they might be afraid, or they might want to wait for a while and let others go first. Then, when they saw that things weren't going well, they directly backed out. For example, the Savoy family. According to his maid Cathy's report, this half-elven royal family was actually inquiring about the doctor who delivered Aisha's baby. Obviously, they were up to no good, but during the rebellion, they didn't show up. Therefore, Knight Roger's list didn't include the Savoy family. However, Marquis Vincent's list included them. The Savoy family. Are you sure they participated in the rebellion? Colin asked. Yes, Baron Savoy personally participated in the secret meeting I organized. Obviously, he also had ulterior motives. Then, what plans did the Savoy family have? Marquis Vincent revealed a sarcastic smile and said, "My lord, that Baron Savoy actually wanted to bribe the doctor who delivered Her Majesty's baby. But in my opinion, this was obviously an extremely stupid move. The doctor who delivered Her Majesty's baby must have been carefully selected. How could he be so easily bribed? His plan would only alert the enemy. Therefore, I immediately rejected Baron Savoy's plan and only ordered him to follow the Silvermoon Guard." Colin nodded and said, "Obviously, he didn't do as you said." Marquis Vincent understood Colin's meaning and shrugged, "This isn't strange. There are always some self-righteous idiots in this world." Indeed. Colin glanced at Marquis Vincent and laughed, "Your plan to let Duke Muller and Madame Sharon take action is much smarter." Marquis Vincent was stunned when he heard this. He hesitated for a moment before saying, "My lord, I don't understand what you mean." Colin looked at Marquis Vincent seriously and asked, "You didn't arrange for Duke Muller and Madame Sharon?" "No." Marquis Vincent shook his head. "Her Majesty Aisha is from the Miller family. Why would I take the risk to rope in Duke Muller and Madame Sharon to participate in the rebellion?" Colin frowned and hurriedly looked through the list of names that Marquis Vincent gave him. Indeed, he didn't find any members of the Miller family. He didn't think that Marquis Vincent was lying. After all, the rebellion had failed and there was no need to lie. Moreover, thinking about it carefully, Marquis Vincent had already persuaded the High Priestess of the Goddess of Destiny to hold the Blessing of Blood ceremony to forcefully increase the bloodline of the fetus in Aisha's womb and cause a difficult birth. In that case, there was no need for Madame Sharon to poison Aisha with the energy potion. So, Madame Sharon and Duke Muller participated in the rebellion on their own accord? Colin thought about it and felt that it was possible. Although Duke Muller wasn't instigated by Marquis Vincent, he was probably planning to take advantage of the situation when he sensed the rebellion in Silverymoon City. After all, if Aisha had an accident during the birth, Duke Muller would be the first in line to the throne. But then Colin recalled that when he exposed Duke Muller, the latter had admitted that he was bewitched by the Eastern region to participate in the rebellion. Under those circumstances, Duke Muller had no need to lie. Colin frowned and realized that there might be some hidden information that he had overlooked. Seeing that Colin was silent, Marquis Vincent quickly asked, "Sir, is there something wrong?" "Just a small problem." Colin smiled and shook his head. He didn't think too much about it and prepared to personally interrogate Madame Sharon later. He put away the list of rebels that Marquis Vincent had given him and said, "Next, I need you to cooperate with me." Marquis Vincent immediately lowered his head and placed his hand on his chest. "It's my greatest honor to be able to serve the Chosen One." Chapter 395. Cough cough, can we drink this wine now? In the hall of the palace, a half-elf merchant asked with a hoarse voice. They were invited here by Count Angeli, but Marquis Vincent was assassinated before they could finish their conversation. After Count Angeli left, the half-elf merchants looked at the red wine in front of them and couldn't hold back anymore. But even so, no one dared to touch the wine first. "Just take a sip and drink a little. It shouldn't be a problem," someone suggested. Although the person suggested this, he didn't touch the wine himself. There was another awkward silence. Finally, Javier couldn't hold it in any longer. Under the surprised gazes of the bystanders, he downed the wine in front of him in one gulp. "Where's the maid? Please fill my glass." However, the awkward thing was that no maid came in at all. Havel snorted and stood up immediately. But just as he was about to leave, the armored guard standing by the side immediately stepped forward and stopped him. Javier didn't dare to break in, so he said politely, "I just want a maid to fill my glass." But the guards didn't say anything, they just stood in front of Javier. Javier couldn't hold back his anger anymore, he shouted, "We've been sitting here for half a day, can't we just have some wine to quench our thirst? Is this how the palace treats its guests?" As soon as he finished speaking, a cold voice came from outside the hall, "How the palace treats its guests? Mr. Javier, do you think you're a guest?" Javier heard this familiar voice and froze on the spot. The half-elf merchants looked at Colin striding into the hall. They were gloating about Javier's misfortune, but they were also worried about their own fate. At the same time, they were even more curious about whether the assassination attempt on Marquis Vincent had succeeded. If Marquis Vincent really died in Silver Moon City, the East region would definitely not let it go. Unfortunately, Colin's expression when he came in was the same as when he left. He was calm and indifferent, as if nothing had happened. The half-elf merchants couldn't find any clues from his expression. Earl. Colin walked past Javier without looking at him. He sat down on the main seat and interrupted the stammering Javier. "In my eyes, you are criminals who participated in the rebellion, not guests. Which one of you still doesn't understand your situation?" Colin glanced around, and when he saw that no one dared to look at him, he turned back to Javier. "Mr. Javier, do you have any comments on my previous proposal?" I think the Count's suggestion is very reasonable. Us half-elves need a unified foreign trade organization to avoid unnecessary internal disputes. Javier quickly praised Colin's suggestion, hoping to get rid of the bad impression that his rash behavior had left on Colin. He also understood that regardless of whether the half-elf merchants were willing or not, Colin would not allow them to escape his control. The establishment of the half-elf foreign trade company was unstoppable. So, since they couldn't resist, they should be more straightforward and take the initiative. Maybe they could win some impression points and even get a good position in the half-elf business circle that was about to usher in a big reshuffle. Sure enough, Colin was very satisfied with this tactful half-elf merchant. The indifference on his face eased a little. He glanced around the rest of the half-elf merchants and asked, "What about the others? Do you have any comments?" At this time, the rest of the half-elf merchants naturally didn't dare to speak out, and they all expressed their agreement. "Good. Then it's decided." Colin clapped his hands, stood up, picked up the wine glass in front of him, and said loudly, "Let's toast together to celebrate the establishment of the half-elf foreign trade company." Ding ding ding. In the crisp sound of glasses clinking, the half-elf merchants drank the red wine in the glass with a smile on their faces, but their hidden feelings were particularly complicated. After the chaos, Silvermoon City regained its peace. But the trauma left by the rebellion couldn't be removed in a short time. The streets were full of patrolling blood cavalry teams. The bodies of the rebels who died in the battle had been cleaned up, but the bodies of the half-elf nobles who participated in the rebellion were still hung in the central square of the city. When the people of Silvermoon City passed by here, they couldn't help but steal a few glances at the old men who were usually high up in the sky. They were frightened, but there was also an indescribable pleasure in their hearts. This political storm was just a nightmare for the ordinary half-elves. They didn't care too much about who won and who lost. They just wanted to live a peaceful life. In a luxurious villa in the business district of Silvermoon City, Javier was welcoming a few half-elf merchants he was familiar with into the living room. After a few greetings, they all fell into silence. Seeing the atmosphere gradually become awkward, Javier, as the host, coughed lightly and said, "I have received accurate news that Marquis Vincent has been assassinated." "What? Are you sure?" "Yes." Javier nodded with a gloomy face. "He was killed by Duke Modwin." "Duke Modwin?" The other half-elf merchants looked at each other, they all found it hard to believe the news. Seeing this, Javier explained, my guess is that Duke Modwin felt that Marquis Vincent had used some underhanded means to forcefully involve himself in the rebellion. Hence, with hatred in his heart, he took the opportunity when the two of them were locked up together to assassinate Marquis Vincent. That's possible. Also, I sent someone to carefully observe Duke Modwin's body in the city square. His body was obviously more rotten than the other half-elf nobles' bodies. This means that Duke Modwin was already dead before he was executed. I also heard that after Duke Modwin killed Marquis Vincent in the palace, he knew that he couldn't survive, so he killed himself on the spot. That's why he died earlier than the other half-elf nobles. The half-elf merchants all nodded. They believed that Javier's news was true. So, Mr. Javier, what should we do? Since Marquis Vincent died in Silvermoon City, the eastern region will definitely not let this go. Should we still follow Count Angeli's request and establish a foreign trade company? Javier sneered and said with disdain, do we have a choice now? This time, no one said anything. Indeed, even if the eastern region wanted to avenge Marquis Vincent, Silvermoon City was still under Count Angeli's control. Killing a group of disobedient half-elf merchants was no different than swatting a few flies. Javier saw the expressions on their faces and said, but, it's not like we can't do anything. Mr. Javier, what do you think? Do you all trust me? Javier didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked in a deep voice. Of course we trust you. You have always been the leader of the half-elf business. Yes, Mr. Javier, we can only rely on you now. Hearing the praises from the crowd, Javier had a proud expression on his face. However, he immediately waved his hand and said, since you all trust me, then I'll just say it. I think that if we want to maintain the independence of the half-elf business, we must seek outside help. Otherwise, we will not be able to fight against Queen Aisha and Count Angeli alone. Mr. Javier, the outside help you mentioned. Who is it? The Eastern region, of course. The Eastern region? Yes. Javier said with confidence, the news of Marquis Vincent's death is still sealed. Obviously, Queen Aisha and Count Angeli don't want the Eastern region to know the news so soon. But if we secretly spread the news? A half-elf merchant thought about the possible chaos and couldn't help but shiver. He said, if the Eastern region really sends troops again, won't our businesses be damaged again? Idiot! Javier scolded without holding back, only when the Eastern region and the Northern frontier fight, can we have a chance to profit from both sides. Now, we can only be slaughtered by Count Angeli. But, will the Eastern region really send troops to Silvermoon City? Someone asked worriedly. After all, the destruction of the Sky Horse Legion was just around the corner. The House of Saint Prospero might not send troops to help Marquis Vincent. Javier smiled calmly and said, we need to do something to force the Duke of Saint Prospero to send troops. The crowd was excited and quickly asked, what should we do? Chapter 396. When did she die? Colin looked expressionlessly at Madame Sharon's corpse in front of him, anger rising in his heart. Unlike the assassination of Marquis Vincent, this assassination was obviously not directed by Colin. Of course, Colin did not feel sad about this person's death. Although she was Aisha's biological mother, Colin had already sentenced her to death in his heart when she was about to poison Aisha when she gave birth. The reason why he did not kill her on the spot was that he wanted to leave it to Aisha to deal with her personally. But he did not expect that Madame Sharon would also be assassinated. Even if she had to die, she should have died at the hands of Aisha. Madame Sharon died from poisoning. According to the degree of stiffness of the corpse, the time of death was about last night. Colin nodded and fell into silence. He did not check who had come to Madame Sharon's room last night because it would be meaningless. After exposing Madame Sharon's conspiracy, Colin did not pay attention to this person and just casually placed her in a side hall of the palace. This could not be blamed on Colin's carelessness. After all, he did not feel the need to arrange a heavy guard for this person at first. First of all, Madame Sharon was not a professional and it was impossible for her to escape from the heavily guarded palace. Moreover, after killing Duke Muller, Madame Sharon's life and death were no longer important. A weak woman like her could not cause any trouble after losing Aisha's trust. But when Colin learned that Marquis Vincent did not instigate Duke Muller to participate in the rebellion, he realized that there was something wrong with Duke Muller's motives and that Madame Sharon might be useful. Unfortunately, he realized it too late. When he wanted to interrogate Madame Sharon, she was already dead. However, Colin also confirmed one thing. There must be someone behind Duke Muller and Madame Sharon. Before, Colin had speculated that Duke Muller might have seen the rebellion and wanted to take advantage of the chaos. But now, looking at the silenced Madame Sharon, Colin understood that they were instigated by someone. Moreover, this person did not want to reveal his identity. This was a bit interesting. Colin touched his chin and fell into deep thought. It seemed that there was another force besides the eastern region that wanted to cause chaos in the half-elven kingdom. Who could it be? In the back garden of the palace, Queen Elsa was wearing a loose white robe. She was holding Sylph, who was still sleeping soundly, as she strolled on the green lawn. Her beautiful and charming face shone with the radiance of happiness. Her amber eyes were filled with tenderness and love as she stared at the baby girl in her arms. The soft autumn sun shone on the mother and daughter, as if they were rippling with a holy halo. Behind Aisha, there were two little tails, Prince Harrison and Princess Judy. The two followed behind Aisha, curiously looking at the little life in her arms. They whispered a few words from time to time, and then covered their mouths and laughed. No one knew what they were talking about. Hearing Colin's footsteps, Aisha stopped, turned back and smiled sweetly at her lover. Her voice was clear and soft. "You came at a bad time. The little one just fell asleep." Colin walked up, put his arm around Aisha's waist, and asked, "Why did you get out of bed? Didn't I tell you to rest for a while?" Aisha leaned her body into Colin's arms and said with a smile, "It's uncomfortable to lie down all the time, and I'm very healthy. It's no problem for me to get up and walk around." Colin also knew that Aisha's body was not comparable to that of an ordinary pregnant woman, so he didn't try to persuade her anymore. He lowered his head and kissed the delicate face of the little one in her arms. "Humph. Teacher, you're really not afraid that the whole world will know that Sylph is your illegitimate daughter?" Princess Judy couldn't help but grumble. Colin glanced at Judy with a smile and asked, "What about your father? Do you know how many illegitimate children he has?" Princess Judy suddenly stopped talking and puffed up her cheeks angrily. Even Colin, who was not familiar with the noble circle in the capital, knew that Emperor Reinhardt's illegitimate children were all over the capital. Some people even joked that Emperor Reinhardt didn't have to worry about the issue of an heir. If something happened to his children, he could choose one of the many illegitimate children to adopt. Colin sometimes couldn't help but wonder if this was the reason why Emperor Reinhardt was willing to send Harrison and Judy to him without worrying about anything happening to them. "Father has 9 illegitimate children and 7 illegitimate daughters," a young voice said weakly. Colin turned around in surprise and looked at Prince Harrison. He smiled and said, "You know so much." Prince Harrison nodded solemnly and said, "Yes, even father's illegitimate children are clearly recorded in the royal family." Colin suddenly became interested and asked, "Then how are you sure that the child is Emperor Reinhardt's? After all, I heard that your father's lovers are all married women." "Every lover of my father's would be placed in a specific manner during the period of time when they were being pampered and wouldn't have any contact with their husbands. Your father is really a particular person." Colin couldn't help but laugh. But then, he immediately realized that Emperor Reinhardt was deliberately sowing his seeds. Such a strict and perfect security system, and the situation of every illegitimate child was recorded in detail. Was Emperor Reinhardt's behavior of having lovers all over the capital purely for pleasure, or did he have other motives? Thinking of the golden-tailed butterfly, the Morrison family, on the northern frontier, Colin suddenly felt that this Emperor Reinhardt wasn't secretly doing some kind of bloodline experiment under the guise of having lovers everywhere, was he? Thinking of this, Colin said to Prince Harrison, "Harrison, do you still remember the details of your father's illegitimate children?" Prince Harrison scratched his head and said awkwardly, "I only remember part of it." "Then please write down the information you remember. I want to take a look." "These shouldn't be confidential, right?" "Of course not. I'll write it down now and show it to you when I'm done." Prince Harrison nodded and then ran off as if he had received an important mission. "What about me? What about me? Do I have a mission?" Princess Judy felt that she had been left out and shouted unhappily. "You." Colin rolled his eyes and said with a smile, "Help me design an amusement park." "Amusement park?" "Yes, this is an amusement park for Sylph. Please help me design it. It will be based on the adventures of the heroes I told you before, combined with exploration, mazes, riddles, treasure hunting, and other elements, and create a few minigames that can be used to clear the game. If your design is good, I can gather craftsmen to cooperate with you to build this amusement park." "Okay. Okay. I'll design it, I'll design it." Princess Judy was so excited that she clapped her hands and shouted loudly. It wasn't until the little girl in Aisha's arms woke up that she stuck out her cute tongue and ran off. Aisha patted Sylph's back gently and waited for her to fall asleep again before saying to Colin, "All right, that's enough. You sent the two of them away. Do you have anything to say to me?" Colin's smile faded as he held Aisha's soft, jade-like hand and said in a deep voice, "Madame Sharon has passed away." Chapter 397. Mother. A hint of sadness flashed in Aisha's eyes, but it quickly disappeared. However, Colin was still sharp enough to notice it. No matter how Madame Aisha treated Aisha before, even if she tried to murder her, she was still Aisha's biological mother. How did Mother die? Aisha tried to keep her voice as calm as water, but it only showed that her heart was not calm. She was poisoned to death. Colin sighed and said, "I have sent someone to investigate the people who may have been in your mother's room last night, but I'm afraid there may not be any results." Aisha nodded and understood what Colin meant. She also knew that the two of them did not pay much attention to Madame Sharon's security. After all, they did not expect that someone would come to kill Madame Sharon. At this time, Aisha also realized that something was wrong and asked, why would someone want to kill Mother? The rebellion planned by the Eastern region did not include Duke Muller and Madame Sharon. Colin only said one sentence, but Aisha understood the key point and immediately said, "Mother was killed." "So, other than the Eastern region, there is another force in Silvermoon City?" "Yes." Colin nodded and asked, "Have you been paying attention to the Miller family recently? Do you know which force they may have been in contact with?" Aisha thought for a moment and asked, "Colin, do you know Mother's background?" Seeing Colin shake his head, Aisha continued, "Actually, Mother's surname should be Saint Hilda." "What? Saint Hilda?" Colin was shocked. "Yes. Strictly speaking, Mother is the aunt of the Dukes of the North. Why have I never heard Vera mention it?" "Because her mother was an illegitimate daughter, and she was the offspring of the Duke of St. Hilda 2 generations ago and a half-elf of a different race. Therefore, his mother never dared to claim that she was a descendant of the House of St. Hilda, and the House of St. Hilda would never publicly acknowledge her existence. However, even if she is a lowly illegitimate daughter, her mother still has the noble bloodline of the Holy Knight family flowing in her body. Human nobles might look down on her, but in the eyes of us half-elves, she is still noble. That's why she married my father." Colin nodded as he suddenly realized something. No wonder the previous Duke of St. Hilda wanted to marry Vera to Prince Tup. At that time, the Miller family was so eager to facilitate this marriage. It turns out that there is such a relationship between the two families. Your Miller family has a close relationship with the House of St. Hilda. You can even be considered a branch of the House of St. Hilda. Yes. Aisha continued, at the end of last year, when Queen Medela came to Silvery Moon to coronate me, she was also very affectionate with the Miller family, especially my mother. At that time, I didn't think much about it. I thought that their intimacy was only because of this bloodline connection. Queen Medela. When Colin heard this name, he immediately narrowed his eyes and fell into deep thought. Although Queen Medela had already formed an alliance with Colin in Imperial Dragon City and decided to fight against the forces of the Church together, Colin was not naive enough to think that Queen Medela would really think of her allies in all aspects and not hide anything. When Aisha was coronated last year, Queen Medela coveted the half-elf kingdom and tried to sow discord between Queen Aisha and Colin. Fortunately, the relationship between Aisha and Colin was not as simple as Queen Medela thought. But Queen Medela might not give up so easily. Now it seems that Duke Muller and Madame Sharon may be the spies she left behind. Aisha looked at Colin and asked, "You suspect Queen Medela?" "It's possible." Colin nodded and muttered, "She can't wait for me to fight to the death with the East, so she has enough motive. If Madame Sharon was not exposed and you had an accident, I would just put the blame on the East who started the rebellion. Maybe I would have sent my army to the East in a fit of anger." "That makes sense. Then should I send someone to interrogate the other members of the Miller family? Maybe I can get something out of them." "You can try, but even Madame Sharon has been killed. I presume that even if the Miller family still has contacts over there, they would have been eliminated. Well, I also want to take this opportunity to reorganize the Miller family. I can't let the same thing happen again." "Okay." Colin nodded, his eyes flashing with a cold light. "This time, don't be merciful. Clean up all the hidden dangers and suspicious people. We can't keep being distracted by the rebellion in the half-elf kingdom." "I understand." While talking, the two came to the artificial lake in the backyard of the palace. The lakeside was filled with red maple trees. When the late autumn wind blew gently, the flame-like maple leaves fell one by one, dancing lightly in the blue sky and green water until they could not resist the temptation of gravity and fell onto the surface of the lake. A white gull swept across the lake and picked up a white-bellied finned fish, causing the other birds to fight for the food. Colin naturally took Aisha into his arms and rested his chin on her head, smelling the fragrance of her hair. He was immersed in the picturesque scenery, enjoying the time alone with his lover and beloved daughter. At this moment, all the schemes had disappeared. Colin also did not think about the complicated conflicts of interest in Silvermoon City. Sometimes, Colin even wanted to leave everything behind and only bring the people he loved to a faraway place to live in seclusion. Of course, this thought only flashed through Colin's mind for a moment before it was tossed to the back of his mind. After all, Colin was not stupid. He knew that this was just an unrealistic thought. If he really lost his title, territory, and army, what awaited him would not be freedom, but imprisonment or even death. Strength was the foundation of his footing in this world. Unless he could learn from the elves and seal off the entire forest, completely cutting off all contact with the outside world. But even the elves would not be able to continue living in seclusion. The mysterious prophecy of the Savoy family, the strange actions of High Priestess Trisley, and the appearance of the Phoenix bloodline in Sylph seemed to indicate that the elves were not far from reappearing in the world. Once the seal of the Radiant Moon Forest was opened, Colin was not sure what kind of impact it would have on the current situation of this world. But he knew that he was destined to be involved. So before this, Colin had to stabilize his own base, the northern frontier and the half-elf kingdom. As for the eastern region, he did not have any plans to send troops in a short period of time. After all, with the natural mode of the raging water river, sending troops was always a bad idea. Moreover, what the northern frontier needed now was rest and recuperation. Continuing to be militaristic would only consume the war potential of the northern frontier. In the end, both sides would suffer losses in the battle with the eastern region, which would benefit the royal family. But not sending troops did not mean that Colin could not do anything to the eastern region. Chapter 398. At the end of October, following the end of the autumn harvest, the citizens of Ice Stone City welcomed the annual harvest festival. Although the spring plowing was delayed once again due to the chaos of war in the northern frontier in the first half of this year, it was fortunate that the slave rebellion in Ice Stone City had been quelled early on by Count Angeli, so the spring plowing wasn't affected too much. Also, in the war against the Troll Empire, Count Angeli won a great victory and forced the trolls to send over a large number of young and strong slaves. With the help of these troll slaves, Ice Stone City's spring plowing, autumn harvest, irrigation works, city defense construction, and so on were all progressing smoothly. In addition to the preferential tax treatment for foreign trade, a large number of merchants chose to use Ice Stone City as a transit point for their trade with the giant Demon Empire, causing this city to always be bustling with activity. Therefore, unlike the other territories in the northern frontier, Angeli's territory was already showing signs of prosperity this year. The citizens took the opportunity of this harvest festival to flood into Ice Stone City one after another, expressing their gratitude to the Lord who had brought them such a wonderful life. Although Count Angeli wasn't in the territory, this still didn't dampen the enthusiasm of the citizens. The taverns in the city had already prepared rich and cheap food and fine wine. Steward Eamon even specially invited more than 10 singing and dancing troupes and circuses to conduct a free public tour of Ice Stone City. The men lingered in the taverns drinking fine wine, the women flocked to the market to buy large amounts of goods, and the children chased after the circus's tracks, watching all kinds of novel and interesting performances. They couldn't stop screaming and laughing, clapping their little hands until they turned red, but they didn't feel any pain. However, the topic that the citizens of Ice Stone City talked about the most this year wasn't their increasingly wonderful lives, or how wonderful the performances of the troops were, or even Count Angeli who was far away in the half-elf kingdom. Instead, it was something called the welfare lottery. Did you hear? A lucky person appeared today. Is it the welfare lottery? Of course, other than this, what else could it be? Who's the lucky person? How much did he get? It's a guy called Tom, he won 5,000 copper coins. 5,000. Is that true? Of course it's true. I saw this kid go on stage to receive the prize with my own eyes. Are you talking about Tom? I know that kid. He's my distant cousin. I was the one who told him about the welfare lottery. When he was receiving the prize, I was still shouting for him from below the stage, but he didn't hear me. There were probably too many people present, and it was even noisier than the theater. Ha ha ha, even if he heard it, he would pretend not to hear it. Why? Because he's afraid that you'll borrow money from him. Why would I borrow money from him? If he can win the grand prize, why can't I? Today, I bought 5 lottery tickets and specially picked the lucky numbers. I'm sure I'll win the next lottery. The Earl of Avon led his fiancée, Shalia, into the tavern and found that the customers were all discussing the welfare lottery. During the harvest festival, business in the tavern was very good. The small space was divided into 2 floors. The lower floor was stuffed with more than 30 tables, and each table was full of people. There were also a circle of customers who couldn't find a seat. The crowded and noisy atmosphere made Shalia frown. Fortunately, the Earl of Avon quickly took her to the second floor. In contrast, the second floor was much more spacious, but this was also because the admission fee was much more expensive. The waiter of the tavern could tell at a glance that the Earl of Avon and Shalia's clothes were not ordinary. He knew that the 2 of them must be nobles, so he quickly and respectfully led them to a table by the window on the second floor. After the Earl of Avon sat down, he skillfully threw out a few copper coins and said, "Give us 2 cups of purple cane wine." "Okay, please wait a moment." After the waiter turned around, Shalia frowned and said, "Evan, why do you always like to come to places like this? The Earl of Avon looked at the noisy crowd downstairs with interest and laughed. Because I can drink good wine in these places. Shelia frowned even more and curled her lips. Nonsense, what good wine can there be here? You don't understand. If we're talking about brewing techniques, the wine here can't compare to Noble's wineries, but the wine here has a special taste that Noble's wineries don't have. What taste? The taste of the secular world. The secular world? The Earl of Avon turned around and looked seriously into Shelia's big, bright eyes. He explained, Noble's wineries are full of deliberate hypocrisy. Only here can you taste the real taste of the secular world. Shelia looked at the Earl of Avon's face and suddenly felt that she didn't understand her fiancé anymore. The Earl of Avon laughed and said with a smile, I'm just joking with you. Actually, it's more likely to find traces of His Highness the Prince in a place like this. Shelia's face was full of disbelief as she shook her head. Even if Father came to Ice Stone City, he wouldn't enter a place like this. Also, if an outsider entered Ice Stone City, the first to know would definitely be the Lord's manor. No. If this outsider wanted to hide his identity, he would be on guard against the Lord's manor, but not these commoners. Shelia tilted her head in thought and found that it made sense, so she didn't say anything else. At this time, the attendant had already brought over 2 cups of purple cane wine. The Earl of Avon took the opportunity to ask, May I ask if you've seen a middle-aged man? He's about 7 feet tall, has blonde hair, blue eyes, a cold face, and a purple scabbard knight's sword at his waist. After hearing the Earl of Avon's description, the attendant thought carefully and shook his head. My apologies, my lord, I've never seen the person you're talking about. The Earl of Avon nodded, not too disappointed. After all, Prince Rhy's trail wasn't that easy to find. This time, they had only come to Ice Stone City with an attitude of giving it a try. He then asked, What is the welfare lottery that the people below are talking about? Can you introduce it to us? Of course. The attendant's face instantly flushed red, as if he was very interested in the welfare lottery. That's the welfare lottery. It's designed by our honorable lord, the great protector of the northern frontier, Count Angeli. It's said that it's to raise money to provide welfare to the poor commoners who can't take care of themselves. However, the Lord Count claims that all those who are willing to pay for the lottery are good people who are contributing to the cause of salvation. They deserve to be rewarded. Therefore, the lottery will be opened every month. As long as the number you buy is selected, you'll win the prize. One lottery ticket only costs 3 copper coins, but if you win, you can win thousands of copper coins as a reward. I've even heard that some people have won gold coins. Listening to the attendant's long-winded explanation, the Earl of Avon drank the purple cane wine and suddenly asked, Then can an outsider like me buy it? Of course you can. The Lord Count said that this is a benefit for all the people of the northern frontier. Anyone from the northern frontier can buy it. Then what if I'm not from the northern frontier? Well. The attendant touched the back of his head and muttered, It shouldn't be a problem. When I went to buy a lottery ticket previously, I saw a bard who also bought a lottery ticket, and that guy said that he came here from the distant south. The Earl of Avon took out a silver coin and threw it to the attendant. He ordered, Buy me 100 welfare lottery tickets, and the rest of the money will be your tip. Okay, please wait for a moment. The attendant immediately took the silver coins and ran away like a wisp of smoke. A silver coin could be exchanged for 1,000 copper coins, and it would only cost 300 copper coins to buy 100 lottery tickets. The remaining 700 copper coins would belong to the attendant. He naturally wouldn't hesitate to make such a cheap deal. Shelia was puzzled. You're interested in these lottery tickets? Yes. It's a very interesting thing. The Earl of Avon drank the wine, and his eyes flashed with a strange light. You're tuning in to the Han Lee's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.